All right, everyone. Welcome to the first live stream that I'm hosting. Today is going to be actually a pretty interesting episode. We're going to be doing a live Q&A session following up on the Spartan myth, and I actually have Dr.
I am a work in
Kennell here.
progress.
So this is
Walden
going to be pretty
University
cool.
is where I thrive. Innovative,
Excuse me?
accredited online programs that fit my life and my goals.
All right.
So, okay, hold on. So my name is Rusch. I have a PhD in ancient history from University College London. I now work
Actually,
as
sorry. Can we we'll have to restart this. I'm getting feedback on my end. All right.
Yeah, I'm getting this weird thing where it starts playing afterwards. Whoops.
All right, we're good to go. We'll restart in 2 seconds.
Yeah.
You got it?
I can't play it live because it's gonna feed back, like there's a delay.
Oh, that's okay. We'll just focus on the Skype then. Sorry, everyone. All right, let's restart. So sorry for the technical difficulties. So we'll start over. Okay, so first live stream, as I said, and as we just showed there. So yeah, we'll be starting live here. So it's going to be a live Q&A session on the Spartan myth with Dr. Rusch here. So this is pretty cool. The episode is going to be focusing on the Spartan myth itself, obviously following up on our video and doing some nice feedback live with the historian to answer questions. So I'll let him introduce himself, give you a little bit of background of where he's coming from.
Hi everyone. Yeah, so my name is Rusch. I have a PhD in ancient history from University College London. I currently work as a lecturer at the University of Warwick. My particular topic is actually more classical Greek tactics and military thought, but obviously that has a lot to do with the Spartans, so that's also something that I've worked on in quite a lot of detail, and that's what I'm here to answer questions about today.
Yeah, so he came aboard to help us with the Spartan Myth episode, help point me in the direction for some sources for doing the research, and obviously we relied heavily on his consolidation of those sources, but he's here as a representative for kind of the cutting edge of this topic, which is going to be pretty cool. So kind of what I wanted to do is break down in this quick introduction here, kind of state the purpose of this video. So as I said, it's going to be a follow-up Q&A session on the Spartan myth, diving a little bit deeper into areas that we couldn't cover previously, and then maybe adding a little bit more nuance and color to areas that we have otherwise glossed over. So that's kind of the main gist of it. The way we're going to format this is it's going to be broken down into different sections. So this intro, and then each section is going to be, first section is going to be cutting edge history, talking about that. Then section 2 is Rise of Sparta. Section 3 is talking about super soldiers. And then section 4 is going to be performance in battle. So at each of those sections, we're going to try and focus the questions in on that specific topic. Each section is going to have the first portion be myself and Rusch here talking kind of one-on-one, fielding previously asked questions. And then we'll open up the floor in each of those sections for live follow-up questions. So that's how we're going to do it. So yeah, post your comments in the live chat and we'll try and pick those up, but keep in mind that we want to stick to the structure, so stick to the different sections we're going to be in. Also, before we get started, I did want to kind of clear the air. We had, like I said, put forward this video that was a misunderstood moment, so obviously a lot of people gave us feedback such that what we were presenting was contradictory to what they had learned. There was pushback and obvious noted skepticism, which I think is healthy. So I'll let kind of Rusch address this and clear the air a bit.
Yeah, it's just because we really got a great response from from the viewers. It's really fun to see like the way that people respond to this. But a lot of people I noticed got very defensive, and then there were a lot of other people who seemed to be sort of gloating over the idea of people getting their illusions ripped away or something like that. I mean, that's really not kind of the tone that I was trying to go for when I was advising Julian on the video. It's really more about trying to establish like how people now think about Sparta in the cutting edge of scholarship. And the fact is that a lot of that stuff simply wasn't around 2 or 3 decades ago. There wasn't any of this new scholarship to go on. And so what a lot of people know about Sparta dates from sort of before this period, and they simply wouldn't have been exposed to this cutting edge scholarship. The fact is that history, like any other field, develops over time. People are sort of developing their ideas, they're getting new insights, they're building up better understandings. And as that happens, the public perception of history starts to lag behind. And very often there's like several decades between academic history and public history, simply because it takes time for that kind of information to disseminate, to flow down to a wider audience. And on Sparta, that's very much the case because this research is really just going on now. It's going on the last few decades. And it's really sort of completely reshaped how we look at Sparta.
Okay, yeah, it's a good synopsis. And I do have to say, like, when addressing things, I kind of challenge your preconceived notions, I kind of have a similar thing. So, for instance, I had done a whole documentary on the siege of Masada with like a big Roman siege ramp, and I was talking to an archaeologist who's familiar with that dig site recently, and he was saying, oh, actually, more recent findings are challenging the date of that siege ramp and challenging the fact that, hey, maybe the Romans didn't actually build it. And I know internally I was like resistant to that idea. I was like, no, it has to be a Roman-built thing. So I know like change is something that people aren't always willing to go with, and in history it can get muddy when you're talking about like what's taught versus what is being discovered. There's a big lag there, so that's kind of the
and there's
context.
Also like it's worth pointing out like there's competing ideas here, and it's not necessarily that one is absolutely right and the other one is wrong and has to be discarded. I mean, if you find a particular set of arguments more persuasive, like there's nothing I can do about that. I can't tell you like, no, these are the facts. We're working with imperfect source material. It's just about sort of trying to make more sense of more of that material and sort of weighing up the different arguments that there are.
Okay, so I guess we're starting to bleed into section 1, so I'll transition into section 1, which was going to be to talk about kind of what is this cutting edge history. So the first thing I did want to mention that in the original video description and the description of the live stream itself, we did post the sources, so you're definitely open to go ahead and read those. But then also, Rule, I think you can point to other places people can follow up with more questions if they have them.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, I could probably sort of provide you with a comprehensive reading list, but there's also the panel that I work on that I normally sort of inhabit is Ask Historians, the subreddit of professional historians on Reddit, which is where you can come and ask any questions that you might have.
Okay, awesome. Yeah, so we'll be sure to kind of link those in the follow-up so people can go and head on over there, because a lot of the times with history, you can't just get it done in the 20-minute video that I did or the hour and a half that we'll be spending here. There's always deeper and deeper that you can dig. So yeah, that's what we'll recommend to people. So yeah, let's get into this section 1, because this may be kind of the meat of it. I would say is, what is this cutting edge history? So I had pulled a couple questions previously. So the first one that someone or several people were asking was kind of, how hot is this historical topic? Like, how recent are we now kind of rediscovering things or changing our opinion of things?
So, I mean, new research on Sparta, like I said, is really like, this is cutting edge. This is going on right now, which is to say that since about the 1980s, we've been getting some sort of reassessments of how people look at Sparta. And it's particularly in the 90s and in the early 2000s that this really sort of gained speed. And we're now getting to the point where there's been a complete paradigm shift, and there's a whole school of thought on Sparta that is basically completely opposed to everything that we used to think on that topic. And that's really still in development. And obviously, in terms of how widely accepted that is, I mean, it's pretty dominant now in scholarship. There isn't going to be much sort of orthodoxy around, but it takes time to spread, especially to non-specialists. So this is very much something that's going on right now, like in academia.
Okay. And I guess the people who are kind of at the forefront, they're publishing their books. So I did have kind of a series of books that you had pulled up. I think Stephen Hodkinson was one of the main ones you had relied on.
Yeah, I mean, Stephen Hodkinson has been one of the organizing forces behind it, and he's worked a lot himself on the social and cultural institutions of Sparta, which has been extremely groundbreaking. But he also works together with a bunch of other people. So it's not just like I'm repeating the views of one guy. I mean, we're talking about a school that can sort of internationally set up, including Anton Powell, Nino Larraghi, Jean Ducat, Thomas Figuera, Noreen Humble. There's a whole bunch of scholars who are sort of associated with this in one way or another and are fleshing out individual aspects of it.
Okay. Yeah. So another thing that people were asking is, yeah, this is more recent. It's kind of weird when a lot of things that people were claiming is, okay, these events that we're talking about occurred millennia ago, and so how come is it that just now we're kind of discovering new things? That's kind of the to the lay public, that's kind of what it seems like. How is it possible that all of a sudden we're digging up or finding new information? So people were asking, where is this new information and data coming from?
So, I mean, some of it, as you mentioned in the video, is archaeological evidence. There's been a lot more since the sort of 70s, 80s. There's been a lot more survey archaeology of Spartan territory, of Laconia, which has told us a lot about how this landscape is being used and who lives there and how they live. Like, do they live in settlements? Do they live in isolated farmsteads, things like that? But actually, for the most part, we're working with literary evidence, and none of that stuff is new. It's been known for a very long time. The question is simply like, why are we now sort of completely reinterpreting what that says? It's about sort of getting a new look at it, getting a fresh idea of it, and getting a better understanding of it. And the reason why that's happening now is, frankly, as Stephen Hodkinson himself says, this is largely, and this sounds very strange, but it's to do with the Nazis. The fact is that during World War II, and I mean before that, the Nazis were completely obsessed with Sparta. And the kind of Sparta that you see in a movie like 300, that's the Sparta that the Nazis are completely in love with. And they wanted that to be sort of their template of their society, their education, their way of self-image. They perceived the Spartans as this sort of racially pure predecessor to their own state. And this made Sparta a dirty topic in academia for decades after. So nobody was really looking at it for a very long time because of that taint of Nazi infatuation. And as a result of that, it's only sort of taken until the 70s, 80s before people have sort of really turned back to Sparta and said, actually, there's a lot of stuff here that we need to reconsider. So where other scholarship has been developing more or less at pace, Sparta has sort of been on hold for a long time. And now there's sort of flood of new people looking at that material and looking at it better in many ways, just sort of paying more attention to the context, paying more attention to the chronology of it, like when are these things being written, who is writing them, what is their interest in doing this, how do they look at Sparta, why do they look at Sparta that way? And this is giving us a much better sense of the information that we have. We're not just reading the text anymore and saying, like, these are the facts, go with it. We're looking at it in a way that is much more critical and much more sophisticated. And that gives us a better understanding of the past.
Okay, that's interesting because, yeah, I remember one of the things you had pointed out to me is throughout time, people have looked to the Spartans and either projected their own ideals or their own goals and motivations onto them and kind of, I guess, cherry-picked in some sense or rewritten history to fit what they're looking for.
Absolutely. And so this is fundamentally like the problem with all sources about Sparta is that everything we know about Sparta comes from the outside. It's people talking about Sparta. It's not Spartans talking about themselves. And so a lot of that is done with a certain viewpoint in mind. And most of the time they're either glorifying or criticizing a society that they see as fundamentally different from their own. And that gives them a particular sort of focus on things that strike them, things that they appreciate, things that they dislike. But they're not going to talk about it in a very neutral way. They're not going to just describe things. They're not anthropologists. They're talking in political, philosophical, or historical context where it matters that Sparta is different. And so that's what they focus on. That's what they hyper-focus on. Well, even, and a lot of the time, there's myth-making involved, right? There's self-glorification involved, etc. So
even contemporaries as well, at the same time, we're trying to contrast their own, like Athens or Athenians, we're trying to contrast themselves with the Spartans and picking out like the stability of their politics compared to maybe a more volatile democracy. So even at the time, you have people finding different elements to look at.
Yeah, so I mean, Sparta was always admired as being a more stable political system, being less democratic, because obviously throughout most of history, people have hated democracy and thought it was a terrible idea. And so Sparta offered them the sort of perfect alternative. A state that wasn't democratic and seemed therefore to be very stable, free of civil war, free of civil conflict, and lasting for a very long time, very effectively maintaining the status of the ruling class. But that continues right into the modern period. It's only in the 20th century that people have started to say, actually, we admire Athens. We think democracy is a better idea, is a better ideal to strive for. But for the longest time, even into the 19th century, people thought Sparta was basically the exemplar, the state that we should model ourselves after.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So I guess another question that has recurringly kind of popped up previously, and then also I see in the live chat now, is people throwing around the claim of revisionist history, which I know in some circles or in some contexts can be seen as kind of derogative. So maybe you can address that.
Yeah, I mean, it's fair enough. Like, revisionism has a bad name for the simple reason that, it's a term that is slapped on people who are like denying the Holocaust or things like that, which is really just reprehensible. But then there are other ways in which we can read that term. And the fact is that anybody who looks at history and says, actually, the way that we have understood this so far, the perceived or the received knowledge about this is either incomplete or insufficiently sophisticated, and is therefore revising that view that we have of history. I mean, they are doing revisionist history. That is what we do. When historians do academic history, they revise that view that we have, and that's simply about understanding history better. It's not about necessarily just doing away with older theories for the sake of it, and it's certainly not about doing away with good research and replacing it with ideology and with agenda pushing. It's actually just about sort of coming to terms with how well we know these things.
Yeah, and that's one of the kind of tricky things as well I found with history is over time, scholars and historians are building atop one another, but if the foundation is built upon something, with preconceived biases or incomplete information, then it starts to go. It's hard to continue building along that trajectory if you spot some sort of weakness in the foundation. Then you have to go back
Well,
and kind of
exactly.
tear it down and rebuild, in some sense.
Yeah, and there's a lot of that where if you start sort of like taking away the pegs on which, or taking away the columns on which all of our view of Sparta is built, then obviously you have to then start to rebuild the whole structure.
Okay. Okay. Great. So I think we've covered most of the main questions that I had from previous posters. I am starting to see some live ones, so we can transition into kind of some of the live questions that people are asking. So the first one I see from Elvis Costello here is, why did the Spartans not keep historical records of their own society? Academia was not of interest to them?
So this is, I mean, it's kind of an interesting question because obviously all of the Greeks did this to some extent, but the problem is that we don't actually have historical records for basically any society other than Athens, and all of the other more than 1,000 Greek states, regardless of how much energy they put into preserving their own history, all of that information is essentially lost. So the Spartans, while they themselves may have had some kind of cultural objections to the idea of people becoming sort of professional scholars or anything like that, I mean, that was not allowed. But then that doesn't make Sparta necessarily an exception. There is basically no source like the ones that we have for Athens for any other Greek state either. So this is something that, on the one hand, the Spartans were sort of focusing on, not doing on purpose because they had this picture of themselves like not having any particular profession or not being sort of, philosophers or anything like that. But on the other hand, there's also the problem that just makes them typical as far as we can tell from what survives.
Okay. Yeah, and that's the tricky thing with getting history about the Spartans, who are maybe archaeological evidence is scant, especially with how they built their city and their surroundings, and then you have to pick apart the truth about them from stories that other told, and those stories were written during periods of war or by politicians or philosophers who were perhaps doing it for not just recording straight history, but for getting a point across. It must be very difficult to kind of.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, all of it is about interpretation, and it is about trying to get these sources to sort of to yield what little information they contain, and to sort of separate that from things that are that are just about sort of tendentious or rhetorical or hyper focused on, as I said, on things that strike the author. But also on myth making, on self-aggrandizing, on processes of establishing ideals, establishing ideological utopias, and all of our sources on Sparta are subject to that in one way or another. So we have to be very careful when we use them. And one of the things that modern scholarship has done is basically just to become more careful at that, to do this kind of work more thoroughly.
Okay. Well, about that, I do see a question that was asked. So when you talk about modern academics and archaeologists being more careful, someone had asked, what is the new archaeological evidence that you're mentioning?
So, I mean, this is mostly what I'm talking about here is the survey archaeology. So survey archaeology is the process of a whole bunch of people basically just walking through the countryside and looking at things that are on the surface, like potsherds, coins, little bits of history that are lying around, which apparently is quite a lot in areas that used to be heavily populated. And the benefit of doing that is because it gives you a sense of how intensely a particular area was used and in what era, because obviously potsherds and other elements are dateable. So it gives you a sense of like who was living there, how many people were living there roughly, and in what period it was being used, how intensely it was used across different periods of time. And this has told us a lot about the transition in which Sparta became basically moved on from being a sort of a series of small villages in the middle of Laconia to being a power that dominated the whole region, and the way in which that domination was organized locally.
Yeah, and that's interesting because I remember I had been reading some stuff where archaeologists are having a hard time finding like hard evidence of, I can't remember if it was like Spartan settlements or maybe it was the Perioikoi settlements, but there was like a distinct lack of like evidence of habitation that you would otherwise
Oh
expect?
yeah, I mean, there's a lack of a lot of things, but in particular, what we've found in through these survey archaeology is, I mean, obviously the myth of Sparta says that it was founded somewhere in the 9th or the 10th century BC when the Dorians supposedly invaded the Peloponnese, and then that it started to expand very heavily throughout sort of the 8th and 7th centuries. But when you look at the Spartan countryside, you find that there isn't really any occupation of that area until about the middle of the 6th century, so the 550s BC. And before that time, it just seems like the countryside is essentially empty. So regardless of what the Spartans may or may not have been doing, they certainly weren't exploiting their own territory to the fullest extent, which gives us sort of interesting things to think with when we're talking about like when did they expand, why did they expand, how did they sort of dominate that area, on what was their sort of level of wealth base and things like that.
Okay. All right. So we'll start wrapping this up and move on to the next section quickly. I do have another question that I want to bring up. So Devin Pierce says, when did academia start to come to these new conclusions? So I'll broaden that a little bit because we mentioned, hey, it's kind of in the last couple decades. But could you go maybe a little bit back further? So when was like the Spartan myth originally coined, and when did people start to kind of clue into this?
I mean, the idea that there was a Spartan, I mean, the Spartan myth obviously goes back right into the classical period, but the idea that there was something wrong with the way that we look at Sparta, that dates back to the beginning of the 20th century. So in sort of early in the 1930s already, there was the coinage of this famous phrase, the Mirage Sparta, the Spartan Mirage, which is the idea that, you know, everything that we know about Sparta comes from people who are swallowing propaganda, repeating ideals, casting things in a particular light. They're adopting a view on Sparta that the Spartans wanted them to adopt, but that may or may not have much to do with historical reality. And that dates right back to the early 20th century. But serious criticism of that, obviously, as I said, went on hiatus essentially for the decades of the 40s, the 50s, the 60s. There wasn't really much research being done on this. And it's not until sort of the work of Paul Cartledge, basically in the late 70s, early 80s, but especially from the 90s onward, that people have really gone like, wait a minute, there's something in this. If this whole source tradition is suspect, then what do we actually know about historical Sparta?
Mm-hmm. Okay. Great. Well, I think we can start to move on from this section. Like we said, the archaeological evidence and kind of the evidence of settlement will kind of start to bleed into the next section I have here, which is going to be on the Rise of Sparta. So I think we can pretty comfortably pivot into this. So for the Rise of Sparta here, there are a fair amount of questions from the community being posted, but the main ones I wanted to do in kind of the first section here, which is just kind of you and me doing a dialogue, was Sparta getting started. How did they get so large? I know in the video we kind of glossed over it, where we were saying, hey, Sparta ended up being winning out of being more numerous and just having a bigger manpower base, not necessarily strength at arms, but strength in numbers. That's a pretty short and terse way to summarize their rise. So can you give us a little bit more context there?
Yeah, I think that one was a bit controversial because obviously there is a very important shift in Spartan history where for a while they keep growing and growing and growing, and then afterwards their citizen body starts shrinking and they end up having almost no actual fully enfranchised citizens left by the end of the classical period. So there's a sort of significant shift there. But initially, like what we're talking about when we're talking about Spartan numerical superiority is the fact that by the time of the Persian Wars, Herodotus mentions that there are about 8,000 Spartan citizens. That puts them well above any other Greek state in the area, with the sole exception of Athens. So they have a very large number of full citizens. And unlike the citizens of other states who often sort of have to, make do with making their living with various professions, every single one of those Spartiates is a leisure class citizen, which means they are able to devote themselves entirely to whatever they want. And the Spartan state has certain restrictions in place to make sure that they don't spend their time on the various frivolities that other Greeks devote their time to, and that they are forced to spend a lot of time together, feasting and drinking a lot primarily, but also training together in order to defend their community. And that is what they're supposed to pour their energies into. And as a result of that, they simply have a larger class of citizens that is entirely available for military campaigns, whereas other states have to really struggle to put together that number of men, let alone keep them in the field for any length of time. Sparta has these men available because of the way that they've come to dominate their regional area. They've made all of the local people who are not citizens subject to them, made them work for them in their largest states. And as a result of that, they have their hands free to be warriors. And that gives them an enormous amount of manpower potential that no other state in the area can match. And as a result of that, they can sort of individually beat each of their neighbors and force them into unequal alliance systems, which every time that happens, it again inflates the manpower that is available to Sparta itself, which sort of snowballs into them controlling the entire Peloponnese.
Okay. Yeah, that's what that was an area I kind of wanted to zoom in a bit more on. So like their early rise for local dominance, because I'm a bit more familiar with Roman history and very, very aggressive militarily, starting off with war bands, raiding almost every season, almost cattle wrestling, but then it gets larger and larger and larger, and they just keep pushing out to their neighbors, subjugating them, and then making kind of incorporating more and more people into their landmass, and they just become these big bullies with enough manpower that it starts to snowball. Do you have a similar effect in Sparta? I guess with their early conquests, as they're just pushing out, are they incorporating other people into their into their military as allies, or are they more kind of incorporating other people but using their labor to just allow more of their own population to become warriors?
So it's a little bit of column A, a little bit of column B. I mean, the problem is there is a switch in the way that the Spartans do this. So early on in the early archaic period, I mean, early Spartan history is impenetrable. We don't really know how the Spartans came to dominate Laconia, their own region, and the Messenian Wars are a great big mystery. How did they conquer Messenia? When exactly this happened? There are sources on this, but they're all painfully unreliable. A lot of it is questioned by modern scholarship. A lot of it is being collapsed together. We don't really have good evidence on these early wars. But we know that they initially, for the first several centuries of their existence, they did what all the other Greeks were also doing in the early archaic period, so the 8th and 7th centuries, which is incorporate territory. They just took those lands and forced those people into their own population. The people that they conquered essentially became a part of their state. But where other states were often sort of incorporating these people in order to make them part of the citizen body, like in Athens, in Sparta they became subservient to the existing citizen class. So they became the Helots, who then had to work for their Spartan overlords. And there is a point in sort of the middle of the 6th century when they try to keep doing this. They try to expand into other territories. They try to expand into the towns of Tegea and Argos in order to conquer more territory and force it into, Laconian controlled territory. But this fails a couple of times. They lose a couple of major wars. And from that point onwards, they stop doing this outright conquest and they start building their unequal alliance system. So from then on, from about 550, they are forcing states on an individual basis into this alliance system, which means that they have to support Sparta militarily whenever Sparta says so.
Okay, so I guess to characterize it, so early on then kind of everyone across Greece is, the local small villages into city-states, they're kind of fighting locally, getting more territory, everyone's expanding. Sparta's doing it perhaps at a rate that maybe ends up being a little bit faster, because I think they had, starting off, several villages that came together, so maybe they were able to snowball a little bit quicker while everyone else is.
Well, no, that's actually, that's an interesting thing, actually. The whole idea of the Spartan villages, Sparta is not a single sort of urban nucleus. It's 5 little villages that sort of join together. But this is also true for other Greek states at the time, like Corinth and Athens also begin this way. And they just eventually congeal into a big urbanized center. The thing about Sparta is that it does not actually do this, that it remains 5 separate unwalled villages throughout the classical period and doesn't actually become a single urbanized center until the 3rd century BC, which is really strange. I think that makes them different. But the initial process of these small villages banding together and starting to sort of subjugate the surrounding area, that is very much a typical process for the early archaic period. And you see this happening all through Greece. It's just that Sparta ends up controlling a significantly larger territory because apart from their own Laconia, their own valley, they also expand to Messenia next door and into the Thraeid in Argos territory.
I can see that. That makes sense. So everyone's kind of expanding. They get to different natural rates of or levels of expansion, but at that point, you start to butt heads with other people who have also expanded. So you have a little bit of a calcification, and then you enter, I guess, at that point, the next stage of how do you continue to expand. So perhaps it's an Athenian Delian League, or for Sparta, it's a Peloponnesian League. So I guess that kind of makes sense. To me.
Yeah, that's exactly it. So it's about sort of they realize that there's a point at which the state formation in other areas and the community formation in other areas has advanced to such a point that they can no longer just force these people to basically stop existing and becoming part of Spartan territory. And also they realize that if they get much bigger, their citizen body, which is forced by law to remain in Sparta, is not going to be able to control it. They're not going to be able to put those areas under effective control. So instead, they decide to leave those communities autonomous, but instead to say, like, you're going to have to support us, otherwise we'll come get you.
Okay. Yeah, I think this is starting to kind of make a lot more sense to me, looking at it in stages. So in this early stage, where like other Greeks, they're kind of fighting for local supremacy, we don't have much evidence of what was actually going on. So to draw the conclusion that they're at this point super soldiers is probably hard to even state. So do we have any evidence that they were like superior warriors in this early stage?
Oh, no, none whatsoever. I mean, we have some evidence that they are obsessed with war, which is very likely because they're very busy trying to conquer Messenia. And so we have the very warlike songs of Tyrtaeus, who's a poet from Sparta, who actually has songs about how they were supposed to conquer the Messenians and how they're supposed to fight bravely in battle and how they're supposed to sort of make their citizen proud and all that stuff and prevent themselves falling into slavery. But this is not necessarily something that other states aren't doing as well. Like, they are obviously engaged in wars of conquest, just like a lot of other Greek communities. They end up being more successful at it for reasons that are obscure to us. But in many other ways, we can see that they're behaving, in terms of archaeological evidence, they're behaving very much like a typical Greek polis. So they have their dedications at sanctuaries. They have other kinds of songs that are for, choral dancing for girls. They have, they dedicate a lot of really pretty stuff at their temples. They don't have this sort of image of this austere warrior ideal yet. The only reason why we think that this is already the case is because we have this early evidence of them fighting a war, but that doesn't make them, a militarist society in any way.
Yeah, that's really interesting. That kind of reminds me of looking at Roman history. I mean, early on, they're scrapping, with other local tribes, but the Romans themselves aren't necessarily that much more distinct than the others. They just have a little bit of an edge. They're a little bit more warlike, but nothing that would point them out as being like these super soldiers. So that's kind of cool to kind of get that out. I did want to maybe transition now into the question portion of this, because there are some... let's see, one of them says here, Alexander Cheng, did Argos embody the myths about Sparta? For example, did Argos army have the military training that is usually associated with Sparta? So the reason I wanted to kind of shoehorn that in is because here we're talking about Sparta expanding, us not knowing too much about them, but they did have neighbors. They did have Argos, which for much of its history was resisting the Spartans. So what do they kind of have to say about the Spartans during this period, or maybe even later on?
Yeah, unfortunately, we have no evidence. This is one of those cases where we would love to know how they felt about the rising power of Sparta. We would love to say, oh, this is how they were trying to organize against this threat. But the source material for the other Peloponnesian states is even worse. So we don't actually have any kind of sense of how the Argives responded to this, or any kind of sense of how the Arcadians, who are their immediate neighbors, thought like, oh, yeah, I'm going to have to organize against this threat. There's nothing like that. We just have that one element that you mentioned in the video, is that there is a later source that reports an oracle that says that the Argives were the ones who were famous warriors, but we don't know what that's based on. There's just later traditions that insist that the Argives were the ones who introduced hoplite armor to Greece, but we don't actually know if that has any basis in fact.
Okay. And then I'm also seeing another one here. So during this period, while they're expanding and incorporating other people, first turning them into Helots, and then later just having their expansion be more of a league. So if you're talking about like people becoming Helots, Elvis Costello here asks, do you think a threat of Spartan slave rebellion constantly kept them ready and prepared for battle? So at this period, as they're incorporating Helots, is that what pushed them to become, more martial?
So this is actually very much the traditional view of Sparta, that their entire reason to become this sort of heavily militarized state that people perceive it to be is because they had the Helots and they had to suppress the Helots. And actually, I mean, recent research by both by Jean Ducat into the Helots and their institutions, and Nino Laragi's research into Messenian and Messenian history, actually suggests that this is not at all how the Spartans were interacted with the Helots. I mean, yes, there is a lot of late evidence that they had sort of very oppressive institutions, that they were very sort of heavy-handed in their oppression of the Helots. But at the same time, this comparative research into other slave societies and comparative research into the way that you can sort of hold a suppressed population down suggests that this doesn't necessarily have to mean that they had to be constantly prepared for war. The fact is that we only know of basically 2 very serious Helot revolts in all of history. And on more occasions than that, the Helots proved perfectly willing to fight for the Spartans in war, volunteer for military service, serve alongside them in battle. So there are ways in which we can sort of nuance that and say, look, I mean, yes, the Helots would have had plenty of reason to be upset about the situation they were in. They were living very brutal lives. They were constantly being humiliated by their Spartan overlords. But at the same time, as long as there were incentives for them, as long as there were possibilities for them to thrive within that system, and especially the Helots in Messenia, who lived more autonomous lives, would have been able to see this. It wasn't necessarily in their interest to just violently overthrow this system.
Okay, yeah, because that's the impression you get a lot in books that you get in school, and in some of the slightly dated books that I got. It was like, okay, during this time period they incorporate the Helots, and then now they find themselves, grabbing the wolf by the ears, and they can't let go, and that's why they could become warriors. So here you're saying that relationship is a bit more nuanced. Yes, they had to suppress them, but it was a carrots and sticks, sort of.
Yeah, and there's also the fact that, I mean, yes, the Spartans had Helots, and the Spartans relied on those Helots to have their particular social organization. But the fact is, every Greek state relied on slavery in one way or another. They all relied on a large underclass that just essentially forced labor. And to say that the Spartans had to make special preparations while others didn't is a very odd sort of way of justifying that the Spartans had different, social and political and military institutions, where in fact it seems that if that were the case, then every Greek state would have had to adopt the same way.
Yeah, that's a good point, because that's one of the things we glossed over. A lot of people were pointing out that, hey, in the video when we bring up that the Spartans had slavery, a lot of people were saying, well, what of the other Greeks? Well, yeah, what of the other Greeks? It's a good thing to mention that, yes, everyone here in this time period did have slaves in one form or another, and that, if you would expect the same pressure, as you said, in Sparta to force them to be more militaristic, you would expect the same thing to apply in Athens.
Yeah, and in fact, I mean, the one scholar, Hans van Wees, has pointed out that actually there's quite a lot of evidence for underclasses very similar to the Helots, specifically rural populations that were subjected and made into the slaves of a landowning upper class. That exists throughout the Greek world. That existed in Syracuse on Sicily. It existed on Thessaly. It existed on Crete. It existed early on in Sicyon, Argos. There are various places where we have evidence of this similar kind of underclass existing. So the idea that this is a unique Spartan institution is actually quite wrong. And as a result of that, we have to reconsider this as a reason for the Spartans, organizing their society as they did.
There are some unique things about helotry, though. I see I'm going to start pulling questions from the chat. One of them, let's see, Name Zero says, is there any evidence of aggressive night raids on Helots that took place? So the Crypteia and a lot of elements like that we see popping up. Seems uniquely Spartan, right?
Yeah, so the Crypteia is a weird one, because we have just about 3 or 4 sources that actually mention the Crypteia at all. The earliest one is Plato. So this is the 4th century BC. And we don't really know what it is, but according to different sources, it actually is a different thing. And that's a very difficult thing for us to deal with. So Plato says that it's basically just a form of extreme exercise, like a trial of endurance, where they get sent out in the countryside and they have to sort of make do for themselves. Then later sources say they actually do this to prey on Helots, like they're supposed to kill Helots that they catch. And then yet another source says that actually the Crypteia was kind of like a special military unit that they could use in battle for specific tasks. And so it's very difficult for us to determine what the Crypteia is, what exactly it was supposed to achieve, how many people were involved in it. We don't actually know that at all. We don't know how many of the youths were sent to do this. It's very clear from the sources that there would have been not all of them, but then how many? Is this something that the Helots would have noticed, or was it something that was more of interest to the people who were doing it than to the people who were suffering the consequences?
Okay. Yeah, so that's God. It must be so frustrating having all of these sources. Either you have one source and you're kind of forced to agree with them, or the second you get two sources, you'd think that's a good thing, but then they disagree with each other.
Yep.
So I had another kind of related comment here. Mr. the Champollion says the Helots were a dangerous people who took every chance they could get to kill the Spartans. So that, I guess, is not necessarily representative of the more nuanced approach we're talking about. But there were instances of Spartan revolts. Could you speak to those, maybe?
Yeah, so I mean, the big Helot revolt that we know about, and this is again, like, there are a couple of hints in the sources and endlessly discussed whether there were others, but the one that we know about was in 465. After a major earthquake, a lot of Spartiates died, and then there was a revolt in Messenia. And what clearly happened was that there was a surge of some kind of regional consciousness that they should not be under the Spartan yoke, which was partly the Helots, but also partly the local perioikoi, who are basically freeborn subjects of the Spartans, who are not slaves, but who do have certain obligations to the Spartan upper class. And we can't quite tell. We don't have the internal sources. We don't have Messenians talking about themselves in this. But we do get a sense that this is some kind of regional rebellion, which then ends in sort of a long-lasting war and a major siege, and eventually the people who are besieged are sort of made under treaty to escape, to leave the country and settle somewhere else in the Greek world. And the weird thing is, like, there's been a lot of research by Nino Larraghi in particular on Messenia and how this works. And a lot of early scholarship would have regarded this a particular moment as a Messenian revolt, right? As a revolt of the local population there, who suddenly realized, we are not Spartans, we are not Helots, we are Messenians. So we rise up to throw off this foreign yoke. What he pointed out is that actually the defining feature of Messenian is taking part in the revolt. Basically, the only thing that makes them Messenians is the fact that they have taken part in this, and that this group is not homogenous. They are different people with different backgrounds and different reasons to do this. So there is clearly sort of a nationalist, almost a motive that is imposed upon a rebellion that may have had very different reasons, that may have simply resulted from the needs, the desperate situation after the earthquake, in which obviously a lot of produce and a lot of lives were destroyed.
Okay. I'm going to look through some comments. Okay, yeah, I see one of them. So this is actually a good thing that we should address. So Singularis Lupus says, what was the percentage in the population between the Helots and Spartans?
If only we knew. This is something that people debate about endlessly because we don't have any numbers. And this is true for all Greek states. Nobody ever tells us the number of slaves because they just don't count them. They just don't consider that to be a valid thing to do, count the number of slaves that there are. The reason for a census in the ancient world is invariably gauging military strength and getting a sense of how many people can be levied in wartime. And the result of that is that they only ever count the freeborn adult males, the adult male citizens. And the slaves are never counted. There are a couple of estimates of the number of slaves in Athens, but in Sparta there is nothing like this. So we can only estimate just how many there are. And actually the most recent research has sort of toned down the number per Spartan, where people used to estimate that there may have been as many as 20 per Spartan citizen, whereas more modern estimates say there may have been as few as 4 or 5. We don't really know this. We don't have hard evidence for this. But the important thing to realize is that the Helots were not even necessarily the majority of the population of Spartan territory. There would have been far more perioikoi, so these freeborn non-citizens would have outnumbered the Helots, presumably, and they would live in their own autonomous communities and have their own relationship to the Spartiate ruling class.
Okay. Although if we do want to throw a number out, I believe, was it at Plataea? It's 7-1?
Yeah, so that's a weird one, because that's the one time when we get an actual number of Helots, which is that the Spartans sent 5,000 Spartiates to the Battle of Plataea, which is the decisive battle of the Persian Wars. And they are accompanied by 35,000 Helots, which Herodotus says he knows there were 35,000 because there were 7 to each man. And that's the only time when we get any kind of ratio. It's the only time when we get any kind of a total number of the Helots. Now, obviously, this can't possibly have been all of them, firstly because they were only adult men, but also because they were presumably picked for the purpose and sort of made to match these numbers, if this is a real figure that we're getting here. And we just don't know how that would have related to the total population. So it's very difficult to work with that number, but that is a ratio that we get for what it's worth, 7-1.
Okay. All right. So I guess I'll keep pulling some questions. So, okay, I have someone else here asked, was Sparta a country of war, or were they conquering lands for glory? So I think we kind of went over that. So first, early Spartan time period is them expanding, much like other communities in Greece, regionally, trying to incorporate people directly, and then eventually you get a calcification of the different kind of major powers. They butt into other people, and then they have to find different ways to incorporate them. So for Sparta, it was the Peloponnesian League. For the Athenians, it was the Delian League. So that's kind of what we're going for. But was there ever a sense of them, doing things for glory? Because I think what he's alluding to is, if you look at the way Rome is organized with the consuls, a consul, when they're elected, they want to add, a couple notches on their belt, and that always, the biggest glory is against, a foreign expedition. So do we have something similar in Sparta driven by its political hierarchy or systems?
Well, to some extent, in the classical period, but fundamentally what we need to realize is that ancient Greece as a whole is extremely aggressive, extremely warlike. They are people who are constantly fighting each other for even the meagerest of reasons. And this is something that extends to Sparta as well. And it's difficult to say to what extent Sparta is unique in that. By the classical period, if Thucydides is to be believed, Sparta actually had a reputation for being more timid than other states because they were desperate to preserve the power balance and the order of things that they had arranged previously. Whereas Athens was regarded as the more aggressive, the more assertive and innovative of the two powers. So there are ways in which we can sort of look at Sparta as being sort of militarily powerful, yes, but not necessarily militarily aggressive. That doesn't really happen until later on when they have a Spartan empire, sort of around 400, and when it starts to become important for individual commanders to make their reputation and fortify their status by, engaging in what Stephen Hodkinson at one point called essentially private imperialism, where they basically just go and build their own little base of influence in order to leverage that at home.
Okay. While we're on it, future sections are going to be talking specifically about like the Spartan military, either as a warrior or as kind of an entity, as like an army. So I guess we'll be using this section to continue to address questions that aren't directly related to that. I think we have a little bit more time we can spend. So for instance, let's turn maybe to more politics or their societal structures. So someone here says, Tane Gurnick asks, why were there two kings? Is that kind of something coming from their early development when they're incorporating other peoples together?
The two kings are a mysterious concept. There is no other government system known in history that has diarchy, like that has two kings. Obviously, people often point to Rome and say they had two consuls, but it's not the same thing because the king was a position for life and was hereditary. So this is a very weird institution, and no ancient source actually provides any kind of explanation for it. But Herodotus, who is our earliest comprehensive source on Sparta, already says that this is a very strange and unique Spartan feature of the Spartan constitution. I think the most recent theories on this basically suggest that it's possible that this is a holdover from the merging of those 5 separate villages into one Sparta, where some of the local lords were unwilling to yield power to the collective or to a single ruler, and so they ended up with 2 of the most powerful families retaining some of their status. But it's important to note that the kings are their powers are very heavily circumscribed in the Spartan constitution, which means that these are not simply 2 kings, striving for the supremacy over the state and striving for absolute power. They are a feature, an institution of the Spartan constitution, and their absolute power exists only when they're commanding an army on campaign.
Okay, that's interesting, because I see a comment here. Andy Quash basically asks, how can they work with a two-king system? I watched the video by Historia Civilis and still question how they can manage to have 2 sons in one city. So shout out to Historia Civilis. Definitely check out his stuff. He does great content. So he does a whole video on the Spartan Constitution. But back to the question itself. So asking, how can you have 2 kings and not have them try and tear the society apart? And I guess your answer would be, at some point early on in their history, there was perhaps some tension, but it got there was a balance of power that was figured out and constitutionalized, I guess.
Yeah, there's tension all the while, of course. They're always trying to outdo each other in acquiring influence in one way or another, and that is the reason why their power has to be quite heavily circumscribed and why they have to be submitted to the superior authority, especially at home, of the ephors and the Gerousia, the Council of Elders. And this is kind of the thing, like that you have to imagine when you're talking about Greek communities is what they're trying to avoid is the extremes of possible constitutional arrangements. So on the one hand, complete democracy, which they fear as mob rule, which they fear as a terrible aberration. And on the other hand, of course, tyranny, which is the extreme of one person having no accountability and having complete authority. And one way to avoid that is basically just set up two powers that are essentially equal and just having them sort of try and outdo each other in expressions of beneficence to their community without ever giving one the supremacy over the other. So the idea then is that it's a way to try and channel this competitive energy rather than to try and sort of keep conflict constantly going.
Okay, and as a whole, there's a lot more to the Spartan constitution that gave them a stability that a lot of other city-states drew contrast with, and it was a big envy.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is the whole concept of, I mean, Aristotle talks about this because he's obsessed with studying different forms of constitutions. And he is the one who basically says like they have a very nice balance of what he calls a mixed constitution, which is to say it has elements of monarchy, oligarchy, and democracy, which it balances out against each other so that none of those powers gets too much power and sort of causes the state to become unbalanced and unstable. And this is one of the main reasons why Sparta was heavily respected and admired throughout antiquity, is that they managed to balance the different interests, the citizen body, the richest and most influential among that citizen body, and those who were so wealthy, so influential that they could aim for tyranny. They managed to sort of control these different forces in a way that benefited the citizen community. Of course, what they're glossing over is that this is at the expense of the suppression of everybody who's not an adult male citizen.
Okay, great. Well, we've covered a lot. I think let's get into the juicy part, which is going to be the Spartans as warriors and then as an army. So those are the two sections we'll be getting into, and then after that we'll get into a generalized question and answer session. So we're going to take a quick 30-second plug for the sponsor, and then we'll get into the meat of talking about the military history, which to me is what I'm most excited about. So let me give the sponsors a quick plug. All right, so the sponsors for the original video was the Great Courses Plus. A lot of people have checked them out. They didn't actually select the topic. That was my own doing. They didn't have any input on the video. All they said is, hey, can you give us a plug? Choose a course that you're interested in. So for this video, I decided to come up with the Spartan myth to generate interest in Sparta, to have people dig deeper into their history. So the Great Courses Plus didn't really have any control over what we chose. And I just decided to plug them because I think actually I watched their whole series on the development of the Greek cities, and it's really good. Basically, the way their product works is you sign up for the Great Courses Plus, and you have access to a whole bunch of videos, and they come with lectures. So it's like a self-guided learning experience, and it was great for me to lay a base for the video that we did here. And I'm actually watching some other videos on the High Middle Ages, the early Middle Ages, the early Alfred the Great and things like that, to kind of, for those of you who are coming from the Total War background, I'm using this service to get the historical knowledge about the time periods. So anyways, they do a bunch of other stuff. It's not just history. They have science, math, literature, other types of things. So you would subscribe. Actually, I have a link below in the description where if you click on the link, you get a 30-day free trial, and you can listen to whatever stuff you want, unlimited for that 30-day period. Go ahead and give it a try. And it's pretty cool. Also, I listen to this at work or when I'm commuting. You can switch from video, where you're watching a lecture, or switch to audio, where actually it just plays as a podcast. So it's really great for your commute or if you're just chilling. So yeah, I definitely recommend Great Courses Plus. Like I said, if you click the link below, you'll get a 30-day free trial, and it definitely helps the channel. And yeah, that's it for the plug. So definitely check them out. And they're awesome. Let me know what you think, and if there's any actually courses that you recommend, that would be sweet. Anyways, let's get into the meat of this. So section 3 is going to be the super soldiers. So getting into this, let's obviously give a little bit of context here. So when we say super soldiers, basically what we're playing off of is the common idea of whenever someone thinks about the Spartans, they think that they were the best warriors perhaps in history. You look at the video game Halo, obviously that's where the Spartan super soldiers were derived from. You get a lot of derivatives of this idea. And so this whole section is going to be talking about the super soldier idea, how good individual warriors were they. And we'll distinguish that from the next section, which is going to be looking at their performance in battle, which is perhaps more tied to how they function as an organization. So in this section, like I said, we'll just be focusing on how good of individual warriors were they. And this is a lot of the meat to it. I think people are going to have a lot of questions here. Okay, so the first thing, let's kind of follow the same progression that the video did, in that we'll start kind of from birth and progress onward. So from birth, I think the first thing we've talked about is the idea that there was a selection of which child could survive, the idea of them being thrown off the cliff. I don't think there was too much pushback in that. In the video, we did describe that, hey, that's probably a myth, the idea of that there was a cliff. And the idea of child abandonment is not uniquely Spartan. It's something that was practiced by others. So maybe you can touch on that real quickly, and then we'll get on to the Agoge, which I know people have a lot more questions about.
Yeah, sure. I mean, it's just like the thing that you hear in the opening like monologue of 300, that babies who were misshapen would have been sort of thrown out. I mean, this is something that we learned from Plutarch, who is a source from the Roman period. So he's writing hundreds of years after this was supposedly a Spartan practice. And he describes that purely because he wants to believe that the Spartans are obviously creating this kind of perfect society. But the fact is that we have classical sources describing the life of a Spartan from birth to maturity, and they don't mention this at all. In fact, they mention various practices that the Spartans had in order to increase the birth rate and to make sure that every fertile Spartan citizen woman was basically churning out citizens as long as she could. So this idea kind of goes against the theory that they would practice these eugenic methods. So it isn't clear from the evidence that the Spartans ever actually did this. In fact, one of the most famous Spartans, the King Agesilaus II, was crippled. Like, he had a lame leg. And he hobbled through this on military service to the age of 84. And there was never a question of him being sort of unfit to be a Spartan citizen. So there is definitely, if that was ever a practice, there would have definitely been exceptions, but there is in fact no evidence that this was a real practice until Plutarch says so in the Roman period, and we don't know if that, where he's getting that idea. But the thing that should be mentioned, as you mentioned in the video, is that infanticide was practiced throughout the Greek and in fact throughout the ancient world. That was a common thing everywhere, so that was not unique to the Spartans.
Although what I think was kind of semi-unique is I see a commenter here, Will Helmark, says the only difference in Sparta is that it is state officials who select the kids, whereas in other cities it might have been the parents.
Yeah, but then that's what we get from Plutarch. So whether this source is accurate or not is entirely up for grabs. So we don't know if this is myth making, if this is tall tales, if this is something that the Spartans actually did. We just don't have any contemporary evidence from the archaic or classical period to confirm this. This is only from very late sources.
All right, so we've covered the early childhood, so I think now we can move into the Agoge, which I know everyone talks about. This is maybe the main thing that people talk about when they talk about Spartans being super soldiers. So this is going to be probably a pretty beefy section that we can get into. So yeah, let's talk a bit about this. So the Spartan Agoge, I guess just like we were talking about before with the Spartan growth, first locally expanding through direct conquest and eventually getting, there's different stages of progression. The Agoge, I would assume, kind of follows a similar stage of progression where early on the Spartan society probably had the Agoge, but just it would be similar to other Greek cities in that instance, right? And that's kind of what we point out in the video. And then later on it starts to become more distinct. So where do we draw the line between where it's like kind of similar to other Greeks? Is there like a clear-cut line for where it's similar to where it becomes different, or is it more like just a trend of divergence between their Agoge and the training of other Greek cities?
We would love to be able to say sort of just definitively what the Agoge was and how it developed. But the problem is that, firstly, that the first source that actually describes this in any way is from the 4th century. So when we're talking about the Agoge and projecting it back to the time of Leonidas or anybody before him, we're just sort of assuming. And we don't really have any evidence that there was a very special, very elaborate form of education in Sparta that was sort of mandated by the state. But beyond that, we also have the problem that a lot of the things that we learn about the Agoge, including all sorts of stories like the Crypteia, like the various practices that they had in order to toughen these kids, in order to make them particularly brave and obedient. A lot of that stuff comes from sources that themselves date to the Hellenistic or Roman period. And the problem is that we know that the Agoge was discontinued in the 3rd century, probably very soon after the end of the classical period. Then it was reintroduced on a completely different basis. It was basically redesigned by a philosopher who wanted to make it into the best possible education system. Somebody who was not from Sparta. who basically redesigned the whole program based on what he thought would be the best possible upbringing. Then it was discontinued again and reintroduced again, sort of in the middle of about around the year 140 BC, after the Romans had conquered Sparta and allowed them to have their institutions back. And so we don't actually know if the system that's being described by people like Plutarch writing in the Roman period has any relation at all to the previous, to the Agoge of the classical period and earlier. So even if we assume that this Agoge was in place in the Archaic period, we don't know what kind of shape it took. We don't know what its institutions were. When we get comprehensive descriptions of the system, we are talking about something that is almost certainly just not the same system at all and wouldn't have been recognizable to the classical Spartans.
That's really interesting because, yeah, every time you read about the Agoge, they're saying it's in the context of why they're great warriors. So you'll hear things about them. Oh, they had all this terrible food, and that was or they were kept hungry, and that was to allow them to campaign further. Or, oh, they had their banquets at night in torchlight to improve their night vision or whatever. So you have, or they, all the stories of the little kids having to steal and stuff like that to try and make them more dependent or more aggressive. So you're saying all of that we can't tell if it was early period or Agoge rebooted?
Well, not all of it, because all the things that you just mentioned happen to be from Xenophon's description. So that is from the 4th century, and that is already describing a system which at the end he sort of signs off saying, I mean, the Spartans don't really do this anymore. So it kind of raises the question whether he's describing a system that he thought, that he heard about and thought was ideal, or whether he actually, saw it happen before his own eyes. Or, he sent his own children through the Agoge, so he should have known what its practices were, but somehow didn't manage to describe this to us in any great detail. So there are ways in which we can't really tell, but those elements would have been at least considered to be valuable by the 4th century Spartans, which is about as much as we can say about them. It's very difficult to really sort of pronounce authoritatively whether they would have been in practice in any particular period.
Okay. Well, we do have a question here, and this I'll start kind of pulling in community questions, I guess, at this point. So someone says here, Abyssinia Empire, wasn't the Agoge not as brutal as others thought? Wasn't it tough, but the trainees would also learn a large amount of art? So we can touch on maybe the Agoge was... If we're gonna say we know anything about the Agoge, I would think we would draw on similarities to other Greek cities, and that would be trying to train up their youth to be good citizens. So if we know anything, I would say that's probably, or would you say that's what we know more certainty about, like the citizen aspect?
Yeah, so that's fundamentally how the modern scholars are reinterpreting the Agoge. They're comparing it to the practices in other Greek states, which also had. I mean, even Athens had at one point a mandatory system in which the children of the elite, at least, would have been educated in the values and aspects of culture that they would consider desirable in their citizens. And that, of course, meant a lot more than sort of physical fitness or preparedness for war, although that was an aspect of every community's citizen body's responsibilities. They also included things like, are you able to recognize and participate in our city cults? Are you able to sing the songs that commemorate our glorious past? Are you able to participate in the festivals in which we do things like dancing, choral performances, theater performances? Are you able to participate in what we consider to be our things, the things that we do? And as a result of that, it obviously had to focus a lot more on a number of things that were not purely military. And this is true at Sparta just as much as it is everywhere else.
So to what degree can we say the Spartan Agoge was different than others? Is it just the stories that we talked about? Or do we have other evidence that would set them apart or set the Agoge apart?
The main thing that I think modern scholars would say is different is the extent to which the state tried to control the upbringing of its children, where in other states this is a voluntary process in which you could go if you wanted to, if you could afford it most of the time, if your parents thought that it would be valuable. Whereas in Sparta, this was mandatory for all citizens at the cost of losing your citizenship. So you had to go through this. And beyond that as well, like it was not just the responsibility of your parents to send you to this program and of the training masters in that program to educate you, but it was also the responsibility of the entire community to make sure that you were following the rules of that education. So if somebody saw a child in Sparta misbehaving, they were allowed and in fact required to punish them on behalf of their parents and the community. And according to Xenophon, the story goes that if somebody punished a child and the child went home and complained that some random stranger beat him up, his father was expected to beat him up again. The idea being that if another citizen punishes my child, it must be because my child did something wrong. They will automatically choose the side of the community, not the side of their own child. And in that sense, it kind of shows the extent to which individuals in this system were subordinated to the desires of the community.
Okay. So I see a comment here. Tommy Laborde here says, the Agoge makes me think of the medieval educational system of future knights that they had to go to, the page and the squire. So I'm not super familiar with the medieval educational system. Are you?
Not terribly, but I mean, I guess the concept of an apprenticeship in which you kind of follow people around in order to learn their abilities and learn from them and get trained by being in that environment. I mean, that is something that obviously a lot of Greeks, elite Greek communities were absolutely embracing, and in the particular framework of pederasty, of course. Like they had these lover and beloved couples in which an older gentleman would sort of take a younger boy as his lover/student and would sort of introduce him to the trappings of elite life while simultaneously pursuing a romantic relationship with him. And that is something that was absolutely essential to Spartan society in particular, because Henk Singer, one particular scholar, has suggested that that was the way in which you got selected for the tent group that you needed to be selected to when you turned 20 in order to become a full citizen. So you needed sort of early on to establish that sort of relationship with an older Spartan citizen in order to get access to full citizenship.
Okay. We can start to transition, I guess, into the later years of their life. But I did want to pull another comment. Fatty Lumpkin had said, is it possible that historians at the time didn't see the importance of the Agoge and therefore didn't bother recording any details regarding it? So I'm not quite sure what he's alluding to there, perhaps trying to say that if they didn't write anything about it, perhaps it's that it wasn't anything particularly notable, or I'm not quite sure.
No, it's actually, I mean, the Agoge takes quite a lot of importance in the writings, like I said, of Xenophon and others. They absolutely thought that it was an important thing, that it was something that, marked the Spartans out as being particularly good at preparing their citizens for citizenship, which in turn, because it focused on keeping their citizens obedient and disciplined, it meant that they were obviously better citizens who weren't going to cause trouble when they grew up, who weren't going to cause sort of factional strife and civil war. So in that sense, there is a lot of focus on the concept of it and the way that they sort of enforce it on their citizens. The problem with it is that throughout the classical period, as several authors attest, Sparta was a secretive community. They didn't let others come in and watch how they did things. It wasn't until sort of the 4th century that they start allowing other people to take part in the Agoge and sort of participating in their customs. So it was difficult for people to find out how things were done at Sparta. And that obviously contributes to the difficulties that we have trying to piece that together.
Okay. So as kids, oftentimes you see in videos, especially in the movie 300, that there's little kids wrestling, punching each other, doing like martial arts. And we don't have much evidence of that, I would assume. So to characterize the training of the youth 7 to, what was it, about 20? It was mostly being a good citizen, but there was definitely a focus on endurance and things that could potentially be tied to the military, but there was no explicit military training, right?
Yeah, like there's literally no evidence that the Spartan youth ever engaged in any kind of specifically military training. But that doesn't necessarily mean that they weren't prepared to be warriors. That is to say, there was a lot of focus on athletics. There was a lot of focus on fitness. And there was a lot of focus on endurance and self-denial. And self-denial was considered particularly important because when you were on campaign, you had to accept that you weren't going to have your creature comforts that you had at home. You had to accept that your rations were not going to be unlimited, that your bed wasn't going to be soft, that you weren't going to be warm all the time. And in order to, by conditioning Spartan citizens to get used to that, they were obviously creating citizens who were less disinclined, essentially, and less sort of put off by the rigors of warfare. But their preparation was not in any way specifically military, which is obviously something that a lot of people seem to assume, that these kids were taken from their homes at 7 and were then sort of drilled from day one in the use of spears and swords and shields and formation. There's nothing like that. There's no evidence from any source that describes this system, no, regardless how late, that a Spartan would touch a weapon until he was of age to serve in the army.
And I guess we can transition that. So after the Agoge, you start to get I think around the age 20, you then enter, or you try and enter one of the military messes, and that's where you become part of, was it the reserve force for the army? Or what was your intended capacity in the army, or relationship with the army at that point?
I mean, when you became a full citizen, like in all Greek states, you became liable to military service, which is to say that whenever the state needed you, they called you up to war. All Greek armies, all Greek city-state armies are militias. They have no professional army. And Sparta has no professional army. They just have its citizens, and its citizens, when there is a war, will go and fight that war because their job is to protect the community and defend its interests. So when a Spartan citizen came of age and turned 20, they were to join these tent groups, and these tent groups were to be the core of their military units. When there was war, they were called up to fight. And usually they were called up by age group, which meant that the youngest were most often called up to fight. And by the time you got into the age of past 40, past 45, you would more often be sort of left out of the band of the levy, basically. But the young would then be sort of called up at need whenever there was any kind of conflict.
Okay. So as for the training, once you kind of have a weapon put in your hand, so to speak, at this age, then do we start to see more focus on the training and education being more military? Because a lot of people in the comment section right now are asking us to talk about the pancration and the martial arts technique.
I mean, this is sports, right? I mean, this is athleticism, and like I said, there are obviously athletic training is a very important part of it, but primarily to encourage endurance, to encourage strength and agility. It is not necessarily to make them into better fighters. And obviously there is overlap between the two. And a lot of Greeks basically say that in lieu of military training, because they don't have anywhere in Greece, the best thing for soldiers to do, for wannabe warriors to do, is to do sort of physical training, to do athletic training in order to improve these agility and strength and endurance in particular. And this is obviously something that the Spartans would then be working on, but there is no specific military training. That's essentially the exception that I'm trying to make, is that there is no training that you can say, oh, this is directly relevant to their warfare. It's much more about them being fit, not being a liability if there was a conflict. So, making sure that they're best prepared for it if the need arises.
So that's what I was going to say. So one of the things that people are going to point out, and I would kind of agree to, is, okay, here we say, we're trying to tear down or discuss the idea that they were super soldiers. And we'll look at things and say, hey, their training was never like modern military training with explicit training towards, handling weapons and stuff like that. But at the same time, isn't it like as close as you could get to it, like shy of being called military training? Like you're being pushed to be in constant physical fitness, readiness, ready to grapple, you have discipline, you have kind of all the elements just shy of being, trained directly for the military. So is it fair to say we're kind of like on that line? Well,
I mean, it's only because we're assuming that this kind of training has to then lead to them becoming better warriors. Whereas for them, it may have been much more about sort of taking part in the traditional aspects of aristocratic life in the Greek world. I mean, other states were also encouraging their citizens to spend as much time as possible in the gymnasia working out in order to be fit, in order to represent the beauty ideal, in order to be useful citizens, in order to be useful defenders of their community. In that sense, Sparta isn't in any way different from any other state. The only difference is that they make it mandatory. So for them, it is something that they have to do, whereas everywhere else in other Greek states, it is something that they might want to do. And so a lot of people still do it. It's just that in Sparta, there is more scrutiny over it, there's more control over it, and there's obviously more incentive to engage in it particularly.
Yeah.
Which includes the comments that were made earlier about Spartans constantly fighting. I saw somebody mentioning that whenever they met each other, the young men, they would start wrestling and start punching each other. The idea there is there's a selection process for the hippes, so the royal bodyguard, and anybody who's selected for that is then considered to be sort of better than his peers, and so that creates a sort of constant atmosphere of rivalry, which means that, according to Xenophon, whenever these young men met each other, they would start fighting each other in order to prove that they were more worthy than the other of being selected for this bodyguard. But that is, the focus in the sources is not on how that would make them better fighters. It doesn't even suggest that it makes them better fighters. What it focuses on is that it encourages a healthy competition, that it makes them constantly try to outdo each other in deeds of valor, deeds of achievement, deeds of sort of trying to one up one another. And that is a fundamental aspect of all of Greek life throughout the Greek world, like competitiveness of the elite, competitiveness of the upper class in displays of wealth, displays of fitness, displays of good counsel. This is fundamental to Greek culture all the way back to Homer and right the way through.
Okay. Can we discuss a little bit about the Olympics? Because that was one of the points we had brought up in the video. Like, if the Spartan soldiers were so strong and so powerful, you'd expect them to kind of, get all the golds at the Olympics. But I think what we mentioned in the video is that we don't see evidence of that. But I did see a counterpoint where someone had said, hey, the Spartans were banned from the Olympic Games for boxing or other types of fights because normally they would kill their opponents or use deadly combat techniques that were not legal. Isn't this evidence that they were superior fighters?
Yeah, I saw that comment actually, and I had to look it up because I was wondering, I'd never heard that before. And actually, I wasn't able to find the reference. So I'm wondering if they could share their source for that, because I honestly don't think I know it. It's contradicted by early evidence from the Olympic Games, which suggests that the Spartans really did take part and won some of the games. I mean, they're particularly prominent as winners of the running contest in the sort of early 6th century, or late 7th and early 6th century, in the early days of the Olympic Games. But this stops. And this is really interesting. Like right around the time that Sparta starts to do this, like just starts to introduce this heavily athletics-focused upbringing around the middle of the 6th century, that's the time when they stop winning at the Olympics, which kind of suggests that this is something that they're channeling their competition internally, or they're no longer trying to be the best at particular sports, but just trying to be sort of all-around fit citizens. And they stop sort of dominating the Olympics in any meaningful way, where previously, of course, the number of their citizens and the leisure time they had allowed them to excel at the games. From the sort of late archaic and classical period, they just don't do this anymore. And as you mentioned in the video, the only thing that they then continue to excel in throughout the 5th century is the chariot race, which is not athletic at all, which is entirely about how much money you have. Because that is what allows you to raise and train a team of chariot horses, which you then sponsor to participate in the games.
Okay. All right, so I guess what we can do now is we've gone over the youth, we've gone over kind of entering into the military for the first time around the age of 20, and then I think what we can do at this point is kind of pivot to contrasting them with other Greeks. So I'm going to toggle over to our other image here, which kind of shows the Spartans compared to other Greeks. So like we talked about early on, one of the main benefits that the Spartans had is that the territory that they incorporated, they were able to bring in people to be subservient to them, serve as helots, and work the land, which freed up the Spartans to have extra time. So whereas, both Spartans and typical Greeks were militia forces for part of the time, the other part of the time would be used for different means. So for the typical Greek, it would be going back to their farm or whatever they were doing, whereas the Spartans, they had this extra free time. So I think it's that extra free time that in the past we've assumed was used 100% for the military. But I think what we point out in the video is, hey, that extra time isn't necessarily spent 100% of the time for the military. Can you talk a bit more about what they were spending that extra time for?
Yeah, so I mean, it's the old conception is that like they were spending all of that leisure time, preparing for war, being trained for war. The thing is that we actually have, this is perhaps what our sources may imply, but then they also imply that they're doing a lot of other things when they're describing everyday life in a Spartan state. Like Xenophon describes Spartiates hanging around the marketplace. He describes them trading and making deals. He describes them running their estates. He describes how much they love hunting and raising dogs and horses. There are various things that by law they were not allowed to do, like pursue any profession. But that didn't mean that they weren't able to have fingers in lots of pies. That didn't mean that they didn't have maybe helots to run these things for them, or perioikoi that they were contracting to do this. The thing is that a lot of these things are simply aspects of the leisure class Greek's life. And the leisure class in all of the Greek city-states in that sense is very similar. They all pursue the same kind of activities. And the way that the Spartans do it is not that much different from the way they do it elsewhere. It's just in some ways more regimented, more regulated. Like, for instance, one of the things that all the Greeks love to do with their elite peers is to go on these sort of drinking parties called symposia. And this is something that the Spartans did as well. It's just that for the Spartans, it was mandatory and they had to do it every night with their tent group. I mean, that is the way in which they have essentially formalized and regimented a custom that exists throughout the Greek world that is sort of absolutely an aspect of the leisure class lifestyle. But in Sparta, it is sort of more regulated so that they can make sure that everybody is doing it sort of in the approved way, and that it contributes to creating community at Sparta rather than contributing to sort of elite factional infighting. So these are the ways in which essentially they fill their time in much the same way as everybody else. You know, the leisure class, they drink together, they sing together, they recite poetry, they hunt, they raise horses, they raise dogs, they trade, they make money, they travel, they hang around, they try to, get friendly with various people in high places, they try to establish their families, they try to secure their inheritance. They do all these things that matter to rich people in the Greek world. And if that is the case, because we get evidence for this, then that must mean that they had leisure time to do it. So whatever the state was doing with their time to prepare them for war, it wasn't a full-time occupation. They were left to do their own things, to run their own affairs and run their own estates most of the time.
Okay. So yeah, that's kind of the recurring feature we see with the Spartans, is they're not necessarily doing something that the others weren't, but they're just doing it on a more consistent basis, on a more regimented basis, and that in and of itself brings a lot more to the table. Like when you're able to do something but more structured, more organized, knit people together, and we'll turn to the military soon, being able to function as a unit is much, it's like a force multiplier almost. So in and of itself, they're not doing anything crazy, it's just maybe a bit better.
Well, it's the state the state trying to clamp down and regulate and enforce the way to do things, whereas they're not doing anything that's particularly different. It's just that for them, it's they don't have a choice, and obviously that contributes to aspects of the community forming, forming of bonds within that system, sense of shared status that is superior to others. Which obviously to the Greek state is extremely beneficial.
Okay. Oh, and we have a a commenter, Aristomachus, saying, "What? Never heard of Sparta trading until this live session."
Yeah, I mean, but how else would they get the stuff they needed? I mean, the point there is that they weren't traders, they weren't merchants, they weren't allowed to be, right? So this is not about them being themselves engaged in trade. However, they could trade with other people who were then supplying them with whatever it is that they need. And they could also, of course, trade off the surplus from their farms in order to get other stuff that they were required. I mean, it is simply impossible to assume that nobody in this community was doing any trading. It's just that they may have done it indirectly. They may have simply done it through their helots or through the perioikoi that they were in contact with. But this is where, like I said, if Xenophon describes them hanging around the Agora of Sparta, dealing in iron objects, dealing in other agricultural surplus, this means that they were doing these things in order to make an extra buck, or in order to supply themselves in their needs, which inevitably a community has to do. And no matter how much the state says this is not allowed, we are not doing this, it's still going on.
Okay. Yeah, I guess we can keep following up on this portion here, because this is a pretty big part of contention, where we talk about here, okay, Spartans had free time because of the Helots. We classify them as leisure. We've talked about how leisure isn't necessarily the do-nothing, lazy leisure that you would think. They're actually very much active, involved in their community, doing a lot of things, still continuing to work out and do a lot of other things, hunting, very manly things, very, I don't know how to classify it, but they weren't just sitting around doing nothing. So to tag on to that, I do have a commenter here. Tommy Laborde here says, I heard in a college course that the Spartans were not allowed to work at all and instead had to have other people do the job for them. So to what degree is that kind of true?
I mean, that is, that's hardly a regulation. I mean, that's the privilege of the Spartan life. You don't have to work. That's leisure. That's what leisure class means. So the idea is that this is an institute that all Greeks idealized. All Greeks thought the ideal of life was to not have to work, not have to do anything with your own hands, to have people to do everything for you, generally slaves, but also employees if you must, hired labor or tenants. But that was the ideal that they all strived for. And in Sparta, instead of maintaining this as an ideal, they mandated it as a rule. If you couldn't afford to live like this, you couldn't be a citizen. But the idea is the same. They're simply saying, you cannot be of the class that has to work for a living. And that means in practice that whatever it was that they weren't allowed to do, they would simply have other people to do it for them. And we have to recognize that this does not mean that they weren't engaged in those businesses. It means rather that they weren't doing it personally, which is obviously entirely fits the ideal of the Greek leisure class. I mean, this is the same as the way it works in Athens. If you are rich enough, you have slaves to do everything for you. We have a very comprehensive text by the same Xenophon describing how to run an estate, how to run a big farm. And that entirely involves how to train your slave to run the slaves, how to train a bailiff to run the place for you, so that you can, gallivant off to town and engage in politics and drinking parties while your people are bringing in your money.
Okay, and that's another interesting thing, kind of at the end of their life when Spartans get older. I'll try and dig it up, but here it is. Elvis Costello asks, did the Spartan veterans receive a pension from military service, such as land reward or X amount for their military service? So like towards the end of their life, how did the Spartans kind of sustain themselves? Did they just keep managing their estates, or did the state kind of reward military service?
So the military service is a standard element of being a citizen. So there was no reward for that at the end. The reward when you turned 60 was to not have to go anymore. But that didn't mean that they stopped going, or some of them volunteered to go anyway until they were very old. I mean, King Agesilaus, that I mentioned, continued leading armies until his death at about age 84. So there were many people who continued to do this because they felt that this was something that they owed to their community. But in theory, what you got when you retired was that you no longer had to march out every year. You will be able to retire to your farm. And this is something that you would have already had, because if you hadn't, you wouldn't have been part of the citizen body. And in return, what you got when you turned 60 at Sparta was that you would become eligible to be elected to the Council of Elders. That was essentially the legislative power in Sparta. So then you would be able to put your name in the hat. But the selection for the Gerousia, for the Council of Elders, was by election. So most of the time it only went to established members of the sort of top of the elite. So it wasn't necessarily something that an honor that was available to everyone.
Okay. So prior to the age of 60, we have Aristomachus here pointing out, with one difference about leisure, they were forced to enter the military, no choice whatsoever. So prior to 60, you had to be in the army, or if you didn't, I guess you just lost your citizenship, or was there other punishment to kind of force you into it?
Well, this is what I keep saying, like, there is no army in Sparta. There is no professional army. There's no professional military of any kind. There is no fixed institution that exists outside of the citizen militia. So what happens is that when Sparta goes to war, they call up a certain number of age groups from their citizen body, and those people have to go. Otherwise, they're deserters. So that is how it works in all Greek city-states. That's simply the way that Greek armies are raised. And Sparta is absolutely no different from the others. Their army is in no way more professional than that of any other Greek city-state, because they run it in exactly the same way. They have a citizen population that in wartime is supposed to fill the ranks of the phalanx. And that's how you get an army together. So it's not about sort of shirking military duty or trying to avoid military duty or trying to be exempt from military duty. This is what it means to be a citizen. It means that you are one of the people who is called upon to fight if there's a war.
Okay. All right. Well, I think we can start to pivot over to section 4, which is where we transition from looking at the individual to more the unit, the army, and their performance in battle. I did want to kind of wrap up this section here. So to look at the super soldiers here, I guess the way to conclude it is, in many ways they were similar, but the structure of the society, the amount of focus they were able to put on what other people did routinely, the Spartans, by doing it a bit more in a more organized fashion, allowed them to rise to the top of that kind of bracket. So they're not they didn't necessarily surpass everyone, but they were able to just more consistently produce top-tier warriors, I guess, but still within the same...
Yeah, the key point to realize is that every single Spartan citizen is a leisure class citizen, whereas in other Greek states, for the most part, the citizen body contains a lot of different people who have a lot of different forms of sustaining themselves. And the result of that is that there's simply much more scope for the Spartans to impose upon their citizens things they must do, because they have all the time in the world to do it. And that, of course, combined with that sort of increasing compulsion from the state, it results in them being sort of somewhat more prepared and more organized when it comes to the essential duties of a citizen, which include both politics and warfare.
Okay, so if someone was to say, hey, the Athenians had a certain elite contingent of their army, you could say, well, the Spartans had a whole army that was equivalent to that elite. Is that fair to say? Or, well, because they also had the perioikoi and other elements filling in their army. But of the Spartiates, would it be comparable to say that the whole Spartiate body was perhaps, equivalent to another just elite sector of maybe Athens or something?
Yeah, arguably, yeah. Although, I mean, yes, you could say that. You could say that it was an elite in the sense of like they would have had somewhat more preparation than the average citizen of another state. There is, of course, within that body also the royal bodyguard that I mentioned, the hippes, who are selected from that body for their valor and for their obedience and for the extent to which they represent the Spartan citizenship ideals. But they are not an elite in the way that other Greek city-state organized elite troops. So they are not selected to perform more difficult tasks. They are simply an honor guard. So in that sense, yes, I mean, the Spartan citizen body is to some extent the kind of large unit of better prepared citizens that other states sort of had to struggle to assemble in much smaller numbers.
Okay, and their fitness did play into things. Like I did remember reading that the Spartan hoplites were some of the few who could keep up with light infantry. If you're saying in the Olympics, they often won the sprinting races. Their general fitness was probably a little bit higher than the hoplites, and that would be maybe a bit more useful. But in the context of hoplite warfare, I guess that type of fitness, I don't know I think it might be fair to say that the Spartans were generally more fit than their peers. And in that context, how much of a super soldier does that make them? Would be maybe the question I would ask.
I mean, the funny thing is that when you read ancient authors on this, I mean, they're always talking about what makes a person a better warrior, but they're not focusing on combat skills. They're not even really focusing so much on what happens when a warrior fights. I mean, they're much more interested in what makes a person better able to stand the ordeals of campaigning. So what the Spartans had, because of their superior fitness, especially the younger Spartans who had just recently come out of this whole this fitness instilling education system, they had sort of a better endurance, a better ability to cope with the deprivations of campaigning and the ability to go sort of with less food and march for longer periods. These were ways in which they would perhaps have an edge.
Okay.
But it's just that one anecdote that says, yeah, they were able to catch up with light armed troops and they were the only ones to do it. But that's only the youngest of the Spartans. So very likely this is precisely to do with the fact that they had only recently sort of gone through this very intense program of physical training.
Okay, so last little comment before we move on to them as a kind of a unit and an army. So Aristomachus again comments, can you bring up the topic of the Spartan pig stew that was meant to harden them up, unlike the Greek states? Can you comment on that? I haven't heard too much about it.
Oh yeah, so I mean, this is the black broth, which is the food that the Spartans were required to eat every meal, which is essentially pork blood stew with pork, and it was famously disgusting. There's the anecdote of somebody who's made to drink it and says, if I had to eat this every day, I wouldn't be afraid of death either. The idea being that this is something that is supposed to sort of toughen you up. But the main thing is it's obviously it's meat. It's a lot of protein. It's a lot of nutrients that you need in order to be a sort of fit, bulky type person. And while we can argue that this has something to do with them being focused on physical fitness, it's much more likely that we need to see this as a way of them expressing the high status of their lifestyle, because they're eating meat every day, which for other Greeks is completely inconceivable. They would have meat only at times of religious festivals. They would never have meat in their private diets because it was simply too expensive. You wouldn't be able to eat meat on the regular like we do today. And so the fact that the Spartans were eating meat every day was basically a way of them flaunting to the world, like, look how much money we got. Which is confirmed by the fact that one of the ways in which they regulated their citizen body was to say that you had to be able to pay your dues to the mess, which is to say you had to be able to provide your share of that meat that they were eating every day. And in order to supply that, of course, you had to have substantial lands in order to produce the surplus pigs. So in that sense, you can see that this is a way, again, of regulating and formalizing the leisure class aspects of their lifestyle.
Okay, sweet. Well, let's move on to the last section. So I'll pivot over to that. So this section is going to be their performance in battle. So this is a natural progression of looking at them as warriors. So as we said, as warriors, they are very capable of producing top-tier troops, and maybe they had some characteristics that allowed them to have a little bit of an edge, like we said, maybe a little bit better endurance, a little bit better ability to stomach certain foods or go on marching with less food. So, okay, a little bit of advantages here and there, but to me, I think it really shines when you talk to their cohesion as a unit. Same thing happens with the Roman military. They don't shine necessarily on an individual basis, but more because of their structure. So I guess that's similar for the Spartans. So as we move into this performance in battle, I guess we can start talking about, okay, them functioning within an army. So the first place we can start is how did Sparta go from warriors to being in a unit? Did they train together in the off season, or when did they kind of form that cohesion?
Yeah, again, unfortunately, we would love to know, but there's nothing on this directly. The thing is that we assume that when they turned 20, when they became adults, and then they joined the army, that is to say, when they joined the citizen body and started living in these tent groups, they would then start to drill together. And the only evidence for that really is that Xenophon says that they were more able to fight in any kind of position in the formation if there was chaos and disorder in the lines. But really the only evidence that we have that they performed any kind of drill at all is the fact that they performed this drill in battle. And the fact that they are forced to do this together with the other elements of the army. Like you said, their army is composed not just of Spartiates, but also of perioikoi, also of inferiors, people who have lost their citizen status, and also of allies and mercenaries. It implies that if they had to drill and march together, they would have to teach these other troops to do this together with them. Otherwise, this formation would fall apart and would turn to chaos. So if we're assuming that this is the case, we have to assume that this kind of drill was only applied, actually, when the army was called up to march out. So this was something that was sort of a last-minute pre-campaign thing where they got all the men together who would have to fight in the same phalanx and said, right, guys, here's what we want you to do. And that was the only time when the Spartans would have any kind of practice doing this in a meaningful way, because before the whole army was gathered, they simply didn't have all of the hoplites of their line together in one place.
So they wouldn't have done it, because I know prior to that, they're living with their, not necessarily tent mates, but the, what's it called, the Sistea, what's it called again?
Syssitia, yeah, the 10 groups. There are various names for it. But
so they wouldn't have trained in their formations with that group? Because that seems like a ready group to train and practice with, no?
Yeah, I mean, it sounds plausible enough. It's just that there's no direct evidence for that. The thing is, obviously, in order to know what to teach the troops, the Spartans would have to practice this to some extent themselves. We just don't have any specific evidence that this is what they would have done in their off time or with their tent groups or anything like that. The only evidence that we get is that they were, exercising together. And exercise is a very distinct term. That obviously doesn't imply military training. It's literally it's athletics, it's running, it's wrestling, it's these kind of things. So we don't actually know this for certain, but it seems that we can take it for granted that they would have done some drill just so that they could then convey it to the troops when it was necessary.
Okay, so this was mostly done, like you said, once they know they're going to campaign, they'll draw the whatever numbers up that they have, they'll assemble, and then they'll go and they'll start doing their drills to practice. And then whomever is going to be serving with them, allied troops or whatnot, they would push that drill onto them as well.
Yeah, exactly. And this coincides with the development that we see in the Spartan army where, I mean, initially in the Persian Wars, for the first time when we see a Spartan army operating in the field, they're marshaled together. So you have the Spartiates on one end and you have the perioikoi on the other, and they're not in the same unit. And in that account, there is no evidence whatsoever that the Spartans knew formation drill or were even in a phalanx. There is nothing to suggest that they were in any kind of organized formation yet at that time, because this is when phalanx combat is in its infancy. But then later on, we get this first evidence from Thucydides during the Peloponnesian War, where suddenly this army seems to have gone through a transition. And I say suddenly, but really this is across a 60-year period. Seems to have gone through a transition where suddenly the Spartiates and the perioikoi are fighting together in units that are mixed. And these are the units that are actually capable of marching in step and performing formation evolutions. So it's in that period between the Persian Wars and the Peloponnesian War that the Spartans sort of adopt this system, but also reform their army in order to have the Perioikoi and the Spartans in the same units together, rather than marshaled separately.
Okay. All right. So we can go into performance in battle here real shortly, but just to round off kind of Spartans operating as a unit. So a couple of things that made them distinct, like we pointed out in the video. One, they had good discipline. Two, they were able to march with the flute in order, proper order, keep their formation, allows you to have more control leading up to the battle and in battle, which is very important. And I guess the third thing that's most important is their more developed command hierarchy. So yeah, I guess is there anything else that would have set them apart from other Greeks in that capacity?
I mean, funnily enough, the thing that Xenophon focuses on primarily is the fact that they had professional seers and professional cooks in the army, and that their flute players were people whose position was hereditary. So that there are ways that we would not necessarily consider in which their military was simply more organized than the militias of other Greek city-states. Again, I want to stress, like, these are all militias. It's just that in Sparta, when the people were called up to fight, specific people knew that they were going to be playing specific roles, whereas elsewhere in the Greek world, you were called up to fight. You kind of had to see, you had to sort of go and see what was going on, which led to a lot more sort of disorganization and frequently sort of chaos.
Okay. All right. So now I guess we can push on a little bit further, which is going to be to more of their performance in battle. So we'll kind of expand the time frame, like we were talking before in the early conquest, about local consolidation, then development of allies, and then after that, fighting against the Persians, and then after that, turning inwards in the Peloponnese. So now if we're going to talk about, I guess, the different stages of how the Spartans performed in battle, I guess in the early period, they were pretty good. Obviously, they ended up getting the upper hand, which allowed them to consolidate territory. So we can grant them that they were good in battle, but just not outstanding. Then after that, when you look at the Peloponnese, when they're not able to directly control the rest of the Peloponnese, but they're forced to create the Peloponnesian League, they're still a top power. But we can still say that they're not the top power because you have Argos resisting, you have Tegea resisting. So that kind of reins in their performance in battle at that point, right?
Yeah, I mean, what you're seeing then is they're just not capable of imposing their will on others. I mean, they lose several major battles against the Tegeans, and one of them is like this famous anecdote where they actually sort of have the arrogance to carry the chains with them that they were going to put on the Tegeans, and instead the Tegeans win the battle and put the Spartans in chains, which is obviously very symbolic. But it suggests this change that I mentioned, where they initially say, we're going to enslave you and turn you into helots. This fails catastrophically. And as a result of those defeats that they suffered against the Tegeans, they sort of change tack and start to adopt a more sort of indirect form of empire building.
Okay. So, all right, performance in battle at that point. One, we don't have too much evidence, but of the evidence that we do have, again, we see them being pretty powerful, but not rolling over everyone else.
There's like the strongest symbol of this, or really the characteristic one, is the famous Battle of the Champions, in which in a very weird and anomalous event where 300 Spartiates and 300 Argives fought together over a piece of agricultural land on the border between them. And at the end of that battle, there were two Argives and one Spartan left alive. And while this leads to various sort of mishaps and interesting things, the point is that there was clearly no sort of obvious superiority on the Spartan side. There was no sense in which the Spartans were able to simply curb stomp 300 of any other people. They when the numbers were equal, the result was also more or less equal, which strongly suggests that there was nothing particularly special about the Spartans at this point.
Or at least for this time period. And there is a question I see being asked here from Revan. He says, so for this famous Battle of Champions, 2 Argives and 1 Spartan left standing, he says, if Argos was known for its soldiers, why weren't there more of them alive? Why was this?
So I mean, I don't really want to overhype this idea that Argos was famous for its warriors. I mean, this is one source that says this in a sort of oracle. It's a put down specifically. It's some tiny little state that just recently defeated its neighbors in war, and they went up to the oracle and proudly said, "Who is the best of the Greeks?" And the oracle replied, "Well, funny you should ask. It depends on what you look at." And then they list a number of things that certain peoples are best at. including, it says, the Spartans have the best women and Argos has the best warriors. And then it says to this little town, like, you're not the first or the second or the third or even the 12th. I mean, basically just pipe down. And the whole narrative there is basically just to say, like, here's a couple of states that have a reputation for a particular thing. And that's the only evidence we have. We don't really know if Argos was at that point particularly militarily effective, or if there was any reason why they should have been superior to the Spartans in turn. It's just that they had a reputation for being warlike, which may have had to do with their own uniting of the Argolid, the area around them, which involved the expunging of famous Mycenaean settlements like Tiryns and Mycenae, and subjugating them to Argos.
Okay, so we've kind of covered Spartan performance in battle early on. They seem to have the edge, as is evidenced by just acquisition of more territory, and then kind of middle period, them having dominance of the Delian League seems to attest to their power, but again, that is kind of restrained by the fact that Argos is still standing. They have some setbacks. Okay, we've established that. So then the next period we enter is going to be the arrival of the Persians, and during the Greco-Persian Wars, the first one is kind of more localized for Athens' resistance, but I guess the second one, the Spartans are given overall command, so they're definitely at this point recognized by the other Greek city-states as a leading power in the area. So does that not attest to them being like broadly recognized as superior, or is that just because they're one of many leading states and they just happen to be, slightly above the top, or were they?
Yeah,
Go ahead.
They have a superior political position of power, which is largely to do at this point, as I said, at the time of the Peloponnesian or the Persian Wars, with the number of their citizens. They're simply one of the biggest dogs in the shed. And there are a lot of other states that are already subject to them, which is just to say that if you're in the Peloponnesian League, if you're in this unequal alliance system, then you have to do what Sparta says, which means that when the Spartans march out to war, they don't just bring their own men, but they bring the men of the whole Peloponnese, with the exception of Argos. And even then, I mean, Argos at this point actually disputes Spartan leadership. They say we want to have a share in the leadership. And when the Spartans deny them this, the Argives say, well, fine then, sort your own Persian wars out. We're going to go and side with them. And similarly, Syracuse in Sicily actually says, okay, we'll give you all this support. We'll give you 20,000 hoplites. We'll give you all this wonderful stuff if you let us lead the alliance. And the Spartans say, no, that's not going to happen. At which point the Syracusans also say, well, stuff you then, we're not going to help you. And so there are various states that like to claim equal status to the Spartans. They just aren't, they don't get it. And as a result, the Greek alliance against the Persians is much smaller than it could have been. But that simply expresses the power that they had at the time. There is no evidence in Herodotus that there is anything particularly good about the Spartans, or that they have a military reputation at that point. It's really clear from his description that they start to build this reputation off of what they do against the Persians. They don't have it going in.
Okay, so up to this point, they've been able to snowball from kind of being marginally or somewhat better than their local peers. They get enough backing in terms of kind of what they can bring to the table as a military power, that they're able to kind of manhandle their way into the leadership position of the Greco-Persian Wars, and then they reap the benefits from the Greco-Persian Wars of kind of being the leaders. And to their credit, Thermopylae, having a king die and holding to the last man, helps even accentuate that even further.
Yeah, but this really turns out to be the foundation of their myth, is that they have this one act, which is, as far as modern scholars are concerned, is completely inexplicable, where 300 Spartans and their king basically sacrifice themselves for no good purpose and get utterly defeated. And the result of that is that the Spartans get to claim that they sacrificed their own king and that they held to the last man for the defense of Greece, etc. And they spin this into this story that this is always what Spartans do, that they're mandated by law to stand and fight and never retreat and die rather than surrender, and that they do this for the betterment of Greece as a whole. And this is clearly not something that they, not a reputation that they had going in. This is something that they build up after as something that they find obviously very, useful propaganda, justifying their position as leader of the Greeks.
Okay. But then still notably, we talked about Thermopylae. I don't want to get into it too much. Besides the fact that they were amongst, they weren't the only ones to hold there at the end, which is, I think, is important, testifying that others were willing to fight and die. But more interesting to me about that story is, yes, the Spartans may have fought till the end, which is very commendable. Others did as well. But also the idea is, is that something that was ingrained in the Spartans? And we find out that later on, they never really fought in the same way to the death. I think prior to the episode, we were discussing, was there other instances of entire military units or army contingents holding out like that and dying? And I think you had said the answer was no, it was just small pockets.
Yeah, essentially this never happens again. And in fact, there are several occasions when the Spartans either retreat or surrender outright. But it is, I mean, this is the interesting thing about it. Like, we have many more examples of Spartans either retreating or surrendering than we do of Spartans fighting to the death. Nevertheless, there are several occasions when they do surrender, when the sources make it clear that everybody was really surprised that this happened. And according to Thucydides, when the Spartans surrender on Sphacteria, he says that this is sent shockwaves through Greece, because, like, how could the Spartans, the people who died at Thermopylae, how could they surrender? Nobody saw that coming. So they had managed to build for themselves a reputation in which this didn't happen, in which this went against everything they stood for. But of course, in practice, I mean, they were human beings. They didn't want to die. So when they saw that their options had run out, they surrendered. They don't really act in many ways or in any way different from the way that you might expect regular human beings to act in that kind of situation. They didn't make it an issue that they always had to fight to the death whenever things were going against them, or that they were completely unable by morality or law to retreat or surrender. And of course, I mean, when they fight major battles that they start losing towards the middle of the 4th century, there are frequent occasions when thousands of Spartans retreat at the same time, and there's just nothing that happens to censure them.
Okay. Well, following the Greco-Persian Wars, one of the main things that people kind of faulted me on in the video for not discussing was, hey, if you're going to talk about the Spartans not being, as great as the myth would say, how can you completely look over the part where they take over and they win the Peloponnesian War? So maybe we can address that here a little bit.
Yeah, well, the funny thing about the Peloponnesian War is that it doesn't involve any major pitched battles. So the one thing that the Spartans are particularly good at in this time, they don't actually get to do at all. There is one major battle between Spartans and the Argives. There are major battles between Athens and the mercenary forces dispatched by the Spartans, or between Athens and Boeotia. But there is no major pitched battle. It never comes to a climactic battle, basically.
But, I mean, you could kind of make the argument that was a fear of what they could do if you came to a pitched battle. Like, just the fact that everyone's cowering from them could attest to some reality to, like, maybe there's more to the myth than just a reputation.
Well, I mean, there was clear fear of them, fear of Spartans in battle. Absolutely, that's very widely attested. Both because they had this reputation of never surrendering, which is not actually, confirmed by reality, but they had the reputation nonetheless. They clearly pushed it very hard. But there is also, I mean, the specific point that made the Athenians avoid a pitched battle against the Spartans was the fact that there were many more of them, which is not to say the Spartans themselves, whose numbers were heavily declining at this point, but the fact that they brought the entire Peloponnesian League. And so at the beginning of the Peloponnesian War, according to a very late source, according to Plutarch again, the Peloponnesian army contained something like 60,000 hoplites, which is obviously vastly greater than anything that the Athenians could put to the field. And so the Athenians decide, let's not fight a battle against these guys, let's fight this war in a totally different way. And so what the Spartans eventually end up doing, apart from sort of putting a very tight noose around Athens and continuously occupying their land, is to fight them at sea, which is something that previously the Spartans had more or less not done at all for something like 100 years. Previously, they had done some overseas campaigning, but they just stopped doing it after the Persian Wars. So they re-adopted a naval stance in order to defeat the Athenians, and the climactic battles of that war were all fought by navies, which contained very, very few Spartan citizens.
Okay. Right.
So the army mostly stayed at home. That's the main point. I mean, it's a funny thing when you look through the account of the Peloponnesian War and you think this is the big war against Athens versus Sparta. And of course, there are proxy allies and other forces involved, but this is Athens versus Sparta. And you look at the events, Athenians are dying all over the place because they're fighting their own war. But the first, as far as I know, when in 427, when Mytilene, which had revolted against the Athenians, they surrender. And their one Spartan advisor who was there to tell them to hold on because the Spartans were going to come and help, he is captured and he's executed. And as far as I know, like, this is fully 4 years into the war. This is the first Spartan citizen to die. Like, they have not committed a single person to any kind of dangerous situation at that point.
And I do want to talk about that.
So there are very few. Sorry.
Well, I did want to mention that because I had kind of pushed that in the video. like the aversion to risk for the Spartan citizens, and people were kind of interpreting that as them being kind of sissies in the sense that they were shying from a fight, which I don't think is an accurate portrayal of what's going on here.
I mean, it's you can say that they're being cowards, but you could also say that they're being sort of, they're looking after their own self-preservation and playing to their strengths. I mean, it is not. I mean, it's often been sort of presented as a very un-Greek thing to avoid pitched battle, but actually, this is a very common thing. If you know that you're not going to win, you're not going to accept that challenge. Which is, in fact, what happens all over the Spartan military record as well. If they know that they're not going to win, then they're either going to approach it very carefully or they're going to just not provoke that engagement. That's just how Greeks operate in warfare. So they're not going to try and fight anyway, regardless of the odds. They're going to make a very careful assessment of how likely it is that they're going to come out on top. And if they say, like, oh, look at how many hoplites the Spartans are bringing, look at how many allies they've got, look at how many cavalry they've got, they're just going to say, no, we're not going to engage with that.
Okay. And how come, so if at this point in time their population numbers are dwindling compared to the Athenian populace, how are they able to, keep the rest of the league, how are they able to preserve their dominance over the rest of the league? Wouldn't someone else try and take over?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is fundamentally what happens. So throughout the 5th century, you see numbers declining, although we don't really have the direct evidence, and a lot of it is disputed. But certainly by the 4th century, these numbers are absolutely plummeting. So we know that, like I said, by the Persian Wars, they have about 8,000 citizens. By the time of the Battle of Leuctra in 371, they only have about 1,500 left. So you see that this has shrunk dramatically. So where's their power base coming from? Well, partly they make up for it by, like I said, incorporating the perioikoi into their own army, into their own hoplite phalanx, and also raising cavalry units from the perioikoi and from the inferiors, from the people who have lost their citizen status. So there are ways in which they try to make up for it by simply drawing more heavily on the other groups of Spartan society. And increasingly, they also use helots as warriors in order to make up the numbers. So when they send troops overseas, they very often, they will not send any of their own citizens, or only a small advisory council of citizens and a citizen commander. But all the other troops are going to be helots and mercenaries. They just make use of the population that they have and try to preserve their citizen body as much as they can. But even then, obviously this allows them to big dog it most of the way through the central sort of classical period. But it is true that there is constant sort of friction with their allies, and they occasionally have to go to war to push people back into their alliance. There's a war against Elis, there's a war against Mantinea, there's a war against Sicyon. They keep having to try and force people back in order to keep them loyal. And increasingly, you can see the cracks. You can see people sort of really not being happy with Spartan overlords and really not approving of them. And on various occasions, when the Spartans do suffer defeat, there are reports of other allies, their own allies, actually quite enjoying that, quite saying that they were quite happy that the Spartans had been defeated. So this is where it starts to sort of fall apart, because they recognize that there aren't that many Spartans left, and therefore their power is becoming increasingly fragile. And this is highlighted in one particular anecdote of Epaminondas after the Battle of Leuctra, supposedly allowed all of the allies of Sparta to pick up their dead first after the battle, so that the Spartiates would be the last ones left, and so that everyone there could see how many of them had died, just to encourage their allies to take the opportunity.
Okay. And I did want to make a quick mention here. Some people in the comments are asking, Vango 911 says, what is the cause of the decline in the population? So I think from my recollection, it was kind of twofold. One, just the, in order to maintain the population, people have to be eligible for citizenship, so you have to pay your dues. And that was harder and harder to do over time because of land consolidation and the fact of Spartan inheritance laws, where property gets split up over time. So after several generations, the leftover amount of land going to one individual is not enough to sustain them. So I think it was plot, like the land inheritance, and then what is the other one? Land consolidation?
Yeah, I mean, it's basically it. It's about sort of the fact that in a closed system like this, where property is the main requirement for citizenship, you find that essentially inequality grows. So increasingly, wealth is concentrated in the hands of the few. And there are fewer and fewer people who can make the threshold in order to meet to be Spartan citizens. And this is the main reason, as far as we can theorize, why the Spartans have this problem of oliganthropia, which is like the fewness of men, the fact that there are just not enough people.
That's
Not enough citizens.
factor as well, because that's the same thing that happens to the Romans as well, and what leads to like the Marian reforms.
Right. So there, I mean, this is obviously something that when you put a property level on your citizenship, or when you decide in some way to restrict this, then you're going to find that people try to secure their status by acquiring the property of others, and they're going to push other people out of that system. So this is what happens over time, and Aristotle describes to some extent how this works. And the result of that is that the number of Spartiates keeps shrinking. And Aristotle says that in his time, which is the later 4th century BC, the Spartan territory, he says, could support 1,500 cavalry and 30,000 hoplites. But in fact, there are less than 1,000. So he says that all of this land is in the hands of so few people that they just aren't able to sustain or to use the full potential of their land. And in fact, by the 3rd century, Plutarch says that there were only 100 people left who owned land. So all of the land in Laconia, which is a territory the size of maybe the state of Luxembourg, is in the hands of just about 100 people and the perioikoi, who were never going to be citizens to begin with. So this is one of the main reasons why the Spartan numbers were always declining.
Okay. And I did want to touch on this because this is maybe a tender point that I tried to recap in the video. So in the video, what I tried to say at the very end is that the Spartans couldn't take a punch. And what I meant by that is that, so kind of when you're thinking about like militaries and you're thinking of combat, like wars, like boxers, the Romans were a force that could take a punch. They would get knocked down multiple times. I mean, you look at the invasions of Hannibal, losing tens of thousands of troops and always picking themselves back up. That is a military that I would say can take a punch. The Spartans couldn't necessarily take a punch to their core citizenship, and it's not due to the individual performance of the warrior. It's due to the fact of just how their body of troops works. And if you incorporate, their allies into the allies is what allowed them to take the punches, because they were the one absorbing the blows much of the time. So I think that was a tender point that I had touched on in the video that people kind of took the wrong way. So I hope that's kind of clarified.
Yeah, no, I mean that's basically it. It's the idea that you have a core, and it's not that this core is so structurally better than the others that if the core shrinks then the army loses its capabilities. It's much more the fact that increasingly the people around the Spartans, the people who have to serve the Spartans, can see that the odds are swinging in their favor. That's fundamentally what happens after the Battle of Leuctra, is that all of the allies in the Peloponnese can see that the Spartans just don't have the manpower to maintain their hold over the others. So that's ultimately what happens.
Cool.
And the problem is that there are a lot of different methods that the Spartans tried to use to prevent this. Like I said, the eugenic practices are called into question by the fact that they were constantly trying to encourage the birth rate and try to have as many citizens as possible. But the problem is, because of their inheritance laws, which had equal inheritance, so the more kids you had, the more it would split up your property when you died. The result of that was that the more kids you had, the fewer of them would be citizens, because they would fall below the property line. So the very things that the Spartans tried to do in order to stop this development was making it worse.
Okay, cool. Yes, I think we've kind of retraced the whole steps of the videos. I hope we've added a lot more to it. I'd like to move into now the general Q&A, because there's been a lot of comments that have kind of fallen through the crack. Do you have time to join us a little bit longer for that? Yeah,
no problem. I'm just happy to help.
Okay, cool. Now I think we can kind of open the floodgates, so to speak, from the comment section. So if people want to kind of chime in with more generalized questions, I know one of them earlier on that people had posted, Elvis Costello here says, what would constitute a commander in a Spartan army, battle performance or political connections?
So we don't directly know the selection process of this. Presumably you'd have to stand out in some way to the people who would decide on this, which would be the ephors, the elders, and the kings. The kings, of course, would be the supreme commanders in the field if kings were sent out. But very often an army or an expeditionary force would be sent out without a king in charge, and in that case, the commander would be the most prominent of the polemarchs, which is the level of command below the kings. And it seems very clear from the 4th century, when we have good evidence of this happening a lot, that the people who got those jobs were the people who were very close to the kings, who were basically sort of involved in the absolute top tier of Spartan society. Because the thing is that Spartans presented an outward appearance of their of their citizen body of equals, like they're called the homoioi, the people who are the same. But in practice, they're very clearly not, which is demonstrated by the fact that this property was becoming more and more unequally distributed. So there is actually within that citizen body a very few people who are very rich, who have very good connections, who have very good marriage relations, who are probably involved with the kings in one way or another. And then a whole bunch of people who have basically no hope of ever attaining the level of influence that is available to those people. But then there are also a couple of historical examples where commanders are actually chosen from this people who are not Spartan citizens at all. And it's not always clear on what basis that is done. Quite possibly it has to do with their connections, the way in which they stood out as commanders or as leaders or as pupils in their upbringing. But quite possibly what's been suggested is that a lot of their status will depend on who their lover is when they're growing up as boys. So if they're involved to some extent with the royal families or with other people who have connections to those royal families, then they're going to have a much greater chance of working their way up.
Okay. Yeah, that's always interesting to note. Okay, so now that we've kind of opened up the the floodgates to a bunch of questions, we're getting tons of stuff, some of them popping up from earlier that I had said to postpone their questions. So just to kind of let people know a couple that I want to address. So don't answer just yet. I just want to let people know. So the first one is Tommy Laborde says, I previously asked about the importance of women in Spartan society, so we can touch on that. Another one, the Turk 321, alludes to a discussion that was happening in the chat, wanting us to talk about human sacrifice in a Greek context, specifically in Sparta, and the thoughts on Hugh's book, Human Sacrifice in Ancient Greece. So I don't know too much about that. Could you maybe touch on the human sacrifice in Greece or in Sparta real quickly?
Yeah, I'm afraid that's really not my field, so I can't speak authoritatively on it. I mean, I know that there is some evidence that early Greek cults and sometimes cults that continued through the classical period involved human sacrifice, but I don't know how strong that evidence is. I don't know what the date of that evidence is. I don't know what the sort of the intentions of that record is. So I wouldn't want to make any statements on that. I'm not a religious historian.
Okay. All right. Yeah, we'll table that one. So another one that's being asked, Tommy Laborde and a couple other people have asked about the importance of women in Spartan society. That's something that I didn't want to touch on in the main video. It wasn't directly related to it, but I know this is a point of distinction about Spartan society that is often brought up.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is a source of great fascination to other Greeks. I mean, Aristotle in particular writes quite a lot about the status of women in Sparta because, quite simply, he was living in a society. He was not Athenian, but he was living in Athens, where women had no rights. They were citizens, and their citizenship was very important because it secured the citizenship of their children. But they had no rights of their own. They had no political rights. They had no property rights. They had no legal representation. They had no access to the institutions of state. And as a result of that, when he looked at Sparta, he saw something that he thought was very odd, which is women allowed to inherit and own property in their own name, which for him was just completely bizarre. And Aristotle being just, a mind of, to our sensibilities, very conservative persuasions. He basically thinks that this is fundamentally one of the reasons why Sparta fails. Their failure is that too much of the property falls into the hands of women who, in his view, should not have those rights because they're not as good at holding them as men are, and it just sort of creates imbalances and problems in the constitution and in society. But from his account, from his record of this, what he considers to be a failing of the Spartan constitution, we actually get a bit of a sense of the position of women in Spartan society, which is that they had much more freedom to go out, much more freedom to act in their own name, much more freedom to engage in their own activities. We have one very unique inscription that records a victory in the Olympic Games by a woman, which is to say that somebody sponsored a chariot team. A sister of King Agesilaus sponsored a chariot team and won. So Kiniska, she had an inscription set up to commemorate that, which is really unique. And she actually points out in the inscription, this is the only time that a woman has won this, because women weren't allowed to participate. They weren't even allowed to spectate at the Olympic Games. But she was wealthy enough and independently capable enough, she had enough agency to be able to contribute to this in this way. And various other ways, obviously. I mean, the fact that Spartan women were also expected to exercise, take part in public festivals, which meant that they simply had more of a public role and much more of a normative influence than they did in other Greek societies. And while they still had no political rights and they still had no vote in the assembly or anything like that, it seems clear that they would have had greater ability to manage both their own property and their society than they did elsewhere in Greece.
Sweet. Yeah, and I hope we can do a follow-up video on this going more in depth in the future. This isn't the time and place to get into it too deep, but definitely there's a lot to talk about there. Some other questions I'm seeing popped up have to do with Spartan cavalry, Spartan navy, a couple other ones. We'll get to those. I did see Aristomachus here calling me out directly, saying, in my Spartan myth video, I said, and I quote, a well-rehearsed tough guy act, referring to Leonidas and Thermopylae. Could you talk about that a bit, please? So that's directed at me. So I would say towards the end, that wasn't done necessarily with Dr. Roel Konyndyk's approval. I was talking a bit more generally. So the same way I say the Spartans couldn't take a punch, I'm talking more kind of like metaphorically. So a well-rehearsed tough guy act, what I was referring to there is the Spartans, as we've talked about over the course of this video, did want to live up to their reputation. And that's kind of what I'm saying there. I'm not saying that it was necessarily a facade with no truth to it, but that they wanted to act tough, act imposing. They had requirements or expectations that their citizens would work out and embody this tough guy act. So that's kind of what I was alluding to. Maybe
and they had the specific traditions of like wearing their hair really long and making sure that it was very well groomed so that they would look simultaneously sort of wealthy, because long hair was always a sign of wealth, and also imposing. And they had their red tunics, which were introduced somewhere in the late 5th century, probably not yet at the time of Thermopylae, by the way, but certainly later on they wore these red cloaks in battle, and other practices that were specifically meant to make them look dangerous, basically.
Cool. All right, turning to the other ones, people asking questions about cavalry. So Everin Sagan Q says here, did the Spartan army have significant cavalry in battles?
So Sparta has no cavalry, along with the rest of the Peloponnese. They have no cavalry up around the time of the Persian Wars, and it takes them a little while to get some. And that is kind of a mysterious thing. I mean, I researched this myself, and I can't really figure out why they don't have any, because the rest of the Greek world does. And they do suddenly introduce cavalry because the Athenians are constantly raiding their lands, and they realize that they need this defense. Because cavalry is extremely effective in Greek warfare, especially when it comes to containing ravaging armies and sort of controlling the movements of the enemy. So they want to have a cavalry during the Peloponnesian War. They raise a cavalry, and then they continue to have it sort of throughout the classical period. But the problem is that because they maintain this outward facade of equality, in other states, the cavalry is inevitably raised from the leisure class, right? The cavalry requires a lot of money because that's how you can, own and raise horses. So only the richest are able to serve as cavalry. But in Sparta, the richest are supposed to be equals, and they're supposed to be in the phalanx. So the problem is that they cannot organize the cavalry in the way that Greek states normally do. And what they end up doing, according to Xenophon, is basically they have the rich, obviously the citizens, train the horses, raise the horses. But then when war comes, they simply ask people to volunteer to fight on them. And obviously, these people have not trained because the horses are not their property. These people are not necessarily the best riders. These people are not familiar with their mounts. So there are all sorts of ways in which this works out to a very, very bad cavalry. So at Leuctra, they are supposed to be specifically sort of get in the way of their own hoplites. They sort of are immediately routed by the much superior Boeotian cavalry. They perform very poorly. But it is notable that in that period, in the 4th century, they start to get better because they start introducing a competitive element into their cavalry force. They start to hire some mercenaries to add to it, and then the people who are made to serve in the cavalry basically try to compete with them for skill and valor. According to Xenophon, this is basically how they improve their cavalry. And also, they're very numerous. If you compare the number of hoplites they raise to the number of cavalry, they actually have a very large, relatively speaking, a very large cavalry force, which is to say it's not very large in absolute numbers, but compared to the number of hoplites they raise, they actually seem to have a very heavy focus on getting as many of them as they can.
Okay, so while we're talking about kind of other elements of the army, we'll turn to the Navy here soon, but I did want to shoehorn in another comment. Soterisman asked, is it true that the Spartans and Dorians in general disliked ranged units, saying that they were cowardly? So that's another thing we see kind of missing from early hoplite warfare is mixed forces, light troops and cavalry. Is that, what attributes to that, I guess?
So, I mean, this is a very complex question, and I could talk for a very long time about this. Unfortunately, if I have to keep it short, I would have to say that there is some cultural disdain for light armed troops, which is most likely because anybody who could afford it would equip himself as heavy infantry or cavalry, which means that being light armed means being poor. And so for the Spartans, this is absolutely unthinkable that they would themselves equip themselves as light armed troops. So being that there is this sort of cultural connection, this socioeconomic connection rather, which says that light armed troops are going to be the lowest of the low in your society, it's something that most people don't want to be seen doing. And especially our authors, all of our Greek authors are themselves leisure class citizens because that's what gives them the leisure to be historians and philosophers and the like. And so they look down on light armed troops on principle. But that is not to say that they don't recognize the value of light armed troops in a tactical sense. And that's the main thing that that the Spartans also realized during the Peloponnesian Wars. That, guys, we need to have some of these forces because otherwise we're not going to have the full tactical flexibility that we need. And so what you end up seeing is that they simultaneously with their cavalry, they raise a force of archers. We don't know who these people are, where they come from. But generally, there's always sort of mercenaries available that fill this role in the Greek world. And specifically, these mercenaries are often Cretans, and Cretans are Dorians. So you cannot possibly say that the Dorians as a whole, as a sort of ethnic group, were averse to using missile troops. I mean, they were some of the most famous representatives of missile warfare in the ancient world.
Sweet. Yeah, and I'd definitely love to do another video on that in the future. A lot of these are sparking
cool.
good topics. So let's see, some other ones here. I think we can only handle maybe, 2-3 more before we want to start wrapping this up. So a couple of ones. So let's turn to the Navy, the one we've been alluding to. So the Spartans didn't really have a Navy prior. And then all of a sudden after, I guess, did they contribute any naval forces to the Greco-Persian Wars?
Yes, they had a few ships. It wasn't very many. I mean, they always had docks at Bithyon in the south of Laconia, but they never really had a very large fleet. But at that point, they were still considering, operating overseas. There is a period not too long before the Persian Wars when they actually are campaigning on Samos. So they're campaigning across the Aegean. And already in the early Peloponnesian War, they're sending out major fleets. So they are willing to contribute to fleets. They just don't have very large infrastructure for it themselves.
So, but after the Greco-Persian Wars, when the fighting turns inwards, they go to land to try and knock out Athens quickly. Doesn't work. They retreat behind the long walls, and it ends up being a matter of kind of contesting them at sea. Then they ramp up their naval.
With a couple of steps in between, but that's fundamentally it. I mean, the first thing they do is they try to essentially increase the contributions of their allies towards the navy, which mostly means that the Corinthians are bearing the load because they are traditionally already a naval power. And the Corinthians are the ones who are most concerned with curbing Athenian naval expansion. So they're fine with it. They're happy to contribute because this is what they're in that war for. They are contributing to the Spartan effort because they want to push back the Athenians, especially in Western Greece. But later on, skipping over a whole bunch of complicated history, the point is that in the second phase of the war, the Decelean or the Ionian War, the Spartans essentially send a large fleet because they recognize that breaking the fleet is the only way to decisively dissolve the Athenian Empire. They send a large fleet into the Aegean and start deliberately provoking revolts among the allies, supporting the rebellions against Athens, and trying to actually defeat Athens at sea. But for them, this is very, very difficult to sustain. The Athenians simply have more money because they're levying regular tribute from their imperial subjects. And so the Spartans can't actually manage this until they get Spartan funding to help them do it. At which point, the problem is that they don't really have the naval expertise, so they keep losing battles. But the Persians, every time they lose a fleet, the Persians just offer to build them a new one. And when this has happened several times, at some point the Athenians are simply ground down.
Okay. Okay. People are asking in the comment section for any book recommendations, so I'll tell them to check the description for the sources that we used.
I'm gonna probably write up a book list or something because
Yeah, I can make sure to follow up after this. So I think we'll start to call it there. Maybe one last question that I wanted to address. We talked about a lot of elements of the Spartan army. The last question that had been asked here, let me see if I can pull it up. Scott Cosma said, did the Spartans work as mercenaries? So we talked about them maybe outsourcing different elements of their army, but did they actually outsource their own troops to serve for other people?
They start doing so in the 4th century for the simple reason that they need the money. So in that period, you get King Agesilaus in particular hiring himself out along with an army that consists probably primarily of other mercenaries and helots. So not of Spartan citizens, but led by a Spartan king even, and would have a core of some Spartan citizen advisors. And they just sort of rent them out to whoever wants. So they go and fight for the Persians for a little bit, then they go fight for the Egyptians, basically fighting people who are ostensibly themselves fighting Persians or being in some way involved with resisting the Persian Empire, which then allows them to justify their action as sort of pan-Hellenic crusade. But in effect, it's just them sort of hiring themselves out because they need the money. And this, of course, extends into the Hellenistic period when a Spartan ends up training the Carthaginian army and things like this. And there is a lot of exchange of mercenaries between the Peloponnese and essentially the wider Mediterranean world throughout that period, because Peloponnese is famous for supplying hoplites as mercenaries. This includes Spartans as well.
Great. All right, so I think at this point we're going to have to wrap it up. I will say for people who continue to have questions, we can point them over to Ask Historians on Reddit. People can post their questions there. Yourself can answer, some other people as well. So I want to thank everyone for joining us. A couple things that I do want to ask is, like I said, this was our first live stream ever, so thank you, Dr. Roll, for joining us and helping us break it in. I think it was a really big success. I had a lot of fun. We went a bit overboard, but this is great for the engagement. I think this is like a rare opportunity that people have, the general public, to leapfrog over textbooks and go directly to professors. So this is really great stuff. So yeah, I did want to say,
great. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I did want to say, if people could leave their suggestions either on my Facebook, Twitter, or in the comments section, just let me know how we could improve this in the future. That would be freaking awesome. If you have other topics or video suggestions, I'm sure Dr. Will would love to come in and cover other Spartan topics. It would be freaking fun. So yeah, definitely leave your recommendations below for how we can improve, either on Facebook, Twitter, on Ask Historians, and also to continue to make this possible, definitely help support me and the whole channel on Patreon. That way the money goes towards artists, researchers such as Roll, and we can do some really cool stuff. So yeah, that's kind of it. And also Great Courses Plus, check them out as well. 30-day free trial for more learning. That'll be freaking sweet. Any final words, I guess?
Not for me. I'm just really happy to have been able to do this. I really hope that people are getting sort of a better idea of how we understand the past this way and how we sort of get to learn about Sparta in a more nuanced way.
Yeah, and we could definitely have you on more often. I see History Buffs is here in the comment section as well, so shout out to him. He does a great channel where he does some live stream Q&A in the future, so maybe we can get some cross-pollination going. But anyways, that's about it for this video. We've gone on long enough. The video will go live in the future, or sorry, it will be re-uploaded in the future, so be sure to share it around as well. So yeah, thanks everyone for watching. I will see you all in the next one. See ya.